the axe to the Axis. Kayakan to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis. Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the Axis and teach them not to pick on Uncle Sam. The decks for action, the time for speech is past, and do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the Axis, let them know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the Axis, lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the Axis and finish up the trouble they began. The axe to the Axis, Kayakan to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis. Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the Axis and teach them not to pick on Uncle Sam. The decks for action, the time for speech is past, and do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the Axis, let them know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the Axis, lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the Axis and finish up the trouble they began.
And the music is over. Hello, welcome. Yes, we are back for another episode of the Chieftain's Armored Vehicle Society. Woohoo! Cheer, wave, type in applause. I don't know if it's F to pay respects. What it is for applause, eh? Okay, so as we seem not to have scared away Harry Yeide after the last Cavs meeting, he's been good enough to come back because he has done several books. And in this little series, we're just doing the two. We're doing Tank Killers and the Infantry's Armor. I am going to say good things about some of the other stuff like Fight and Patton, but for now, Infantry's Armor is it. Keep an eye out in the chat for the links for the quizzes. Depending on how you do the quiz, you get either in-game stuff, such as a Thunderbolt 7, or you get a chance to win a book. And I know that the article says Infantry's Armor. Hopefully, that is an error. Hopefully, you already have read the Infantry's Armor, because that is the point of this, is that you read in advance, you assess and analyze what you have read, and then you get the opportunity to engage by chat and ask questions of the author. So you have the experts. So instead, what is going to happen is that we are dealing with the next book is going to be the prize for the next author that we're bringing in, and that will be Ken Estes with his book Marines Under Armor. So we're going away from the army side of the house, and we are going to the jarheads, or crayon eaters, or whatever else you want to call the thing, leathernecks. I'm sure they have some politically acceptable name. I refuse to use it. Marine, maybe. Anyway. That is, I think the introduction's out of the way, so hopefully for the next hour and a half, or maybe even 2 hours, I'm going to bring back Mr. Harry Yeide. And go. Aha! He's back.
Good evening. Yep, it's great to be here again.
Yes, you survived the last experience.
It was a lot of fun.
Woohoo! Okay, so Dionychus is already saying he's going to wait until after the talk before filling out the answers to the questions, to the quiz. Hello from Italy! Oh, God, what time is it in Italy? 6:05? It's got to be 6 hours, 7 hours ahead? It's 1 a.m. over in Italy. Ooh, ouch. Okay, there's somebody writes applause. Ricky Rydell says cheers. Okay, so we're going to do this pretty much the same way as we did last time, I guess, is that you have yourself a little slideshow to keep yourself on the straight and narrow and go over it. And as we go over the different segments, we'll cut a break, open it up for questions in the chat, and just generally have digressions and whatever else we do. Oh, it's 1 a.m. in Italy, apparently. Okay. So if Tragic could bring up the PowerPoint, unless there's something you want to start off with, Harry.
No, let's have a tank on the screen to start talking. That's appropriate, right?
It works.
Yeah, okay. So the infantry's armor, of course, refers to the fact that the separate tank battalions were, by and large, attached to infantry divisions and did what the infantries wanted. And there's a very nice picture of some infantry working closely with a tank. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I got to say, out of all the books I've written, the separate tank battalions are my favorite subject. It's what I started with, and what I love about them, when I watched a lot of football, I really liked the line play, down in the trenches, the hard fighting, the slow battle on the line. And, that's what the infantry support tanks were. They were right there in the thick of it with the soldiers at the very front of the line and lived the same life they did. So anyway, let's get on.
Let's talk about why these tank battalions came up. I think that's the first segment, and then we can talk about some of the interesting contrasts with other nations.
All right, let's go. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the bottom lines that I'm going to talk about. First off, that when the Armor Force created, the idea of separate tank battalions was built into it from the very start, even though the emphasis was on the armored divisions. Secondly, the doctrine focused on the armored divisions, which turned out to be a pretty big problem for infantry support tanks. Third, the Army didn't have time or the foresight, perhaps, to arrange for the infantry and tanks to train together before they went into battle, which was a bad idea, especially since they had to, in essence, derive their own doctrine from battlefield experience. Another thing about the separate battalions is they fought in all theaters. Wherever an infantry division went, pretty much, you were going to have some tanks. And finally, it was a very diverse group of battalions by 1943 because specialized units started to appear, such as mine clearing and flame throwing, and the Army organized amphibian, tank, and tractor battalions, which were part of the armored force too.
It seems to be your favorite for some strange reason.
What's that?
What is it with you and M-tanks?
Well, nobody knows anything about them, and I mean, how many things have you read that talks about M-tanks? I mean, other tanks, sure, but yeah, they're unheralded. That's what I like about them. Next slide, please. All right. So my plan is, this was a really big war, and I can't talk about everything in the book. So if you haven't read it, you really should. The book is full of great firsthand personal accounts by people who were involved in these actions. I can't really talk about that kind of thing. I can't talk about even all the campaigns in the book, especially in the Pacific. So I've selected material based on what it has to say about common experiences of the battalions, interesting divergences from the common experiences, and steps in the development of the tank-infantry relationship through the war. Next slide, please. So mechanization, the Army fooled around with it from the 1920s, and the cavalry and the infantry went their own ways during that period. In fact, the cavalry was banned by Congress from having tanks, so they used exactly the same equipment as the infantry and called them combat cars. It took the war in Europe to get things moving because between the wars, the Army was small, 200,000 men. It didn't have much of a budget. It couldn't invest in armor. Whoa, where are we going? Okay. Anyway, in 1939, the infantry finally organized two regiments, a light tank regiment and a medium tank regiment. And the cavalry already had a brigade with two battalion-sized squadrons of combat cars. Next slide, please. So here's what we had before the war. The tanks sucked. What can you say? The medium tank during the 1935-1936 period was the T4. It had 3 machine guns, almost no armor. It was simply not competitive with what was going on around the world. And in 1939, the year that Hitler overruns Poland, the United States produces 15 medium tanks, M2 armed with a 37 millimeter main gun and 6 machine guns. Next slide, please. 1940, the Army really starts getting its act together. Because the infantry and the cavalry couldn't agree on anything regarding tanks, the Army decided to carve out a new force. It was going to be the Armored Force. And they had just held exercises in which the infantry and armored groups formed a provisional armored division, and it had performed very well. So when the Armored Force stood up, these were converted into the first 2 armored divisions, the 1st and 2nd Armored Division. Because the cavalry and infantry had different bases, the infantry had medium tanks, the cavalry only had light. Subunits were intermixed, so they would have the same balance of equipment. Personnel were intermixed, so you had a mix of cavalry and infantry. But still, on the equipment side, the first standardized tank that went into battle was the M3 up there on the left-hand side with a 37 millimeter gun and 4 machine guns. And the Germans were already putting 50 and even 75 millimeter guns on their tanks. Next slide, please. So we talked about General McNair with the tank destroyer force that he inspired, but he was also the champion of the infantry support tankers. And he wanted the World War I practice of infantry support tanks to continue. He was in charge of General Headquarters, which was organizing and equipping the Army for war. And in 1940, the plan was to establish 15 GHQ tank battalions, separate battalions, and they were called reserve battalions at the time. The idea was that they could be, shopped around to whoever need them. And these battalions were medium and light, each had 3 companies, and that was it. It was pretty simple. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk through ahead just a little bit on reorganization so I don't have to talk about it anymore. In September 1943, there was a big reorganization, in part because a battle in North Africa in particular had shown that the American armored divisions had way too many tanks and way too little infantry for effective combined arms operations. So the armored divisions, other than the 1st and 2nd, which were already overseas, reorganized into a lighter organization and released 2 battalions each that became separate tank battalions. And all battalions, except for 6, reorganized on a common pattern. So in theory, you could attach a separate battalion to an armored division, and it would look just the same. They had 3 medium tank companies of 17 tanks and an assault gun, a light tank company, and a headquarters company that had mortars, an assault gun detachment with 3 assault guns, and a small reconnaissance element. This other 6 battalions remain light battalions, and I'm not entirely sure that was. They also created 6 so-called leaflet battalions, canal defense lights. This was a British project. It was super, super top secret. All the equipment had to be specially handled as they put the tanks together and all. And they had big spotlights on M3 medium tank chassis, and they were supposed to dazzle the enemy with flashing lights and create shadows for troops to advance at night. And they were so top secret that no field commander ever knew they existed, so they were never used in battle, and they were all ultimately converted to other battalions, normal or mine exploder battalions. So they did use a few of the leaflet tanks to shine spotlights on the Rhine River to protect bridges. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so duh tanks. It's like duh bears. This is what we went to war with. In the upper left, the M3 light tank. And I posted this picture because it had no intercom system. So the way the commander told the driver where to go was he'd push his foot. If he pushed his foot on his head, he was supposed to start, push the left shoulder, turn left, push the right shoulder, turn right, push his back to stop. And some of the drivers complained that when the commander got excited and wanted to stop, they'd ram their heads down into their dashboard there. To the right of that is the
traverse as well.
Huh?
It's a bit of a problem if the turret is traversed.
Well, that's true too. That was replaced by the M5 light tank on the right. That had a reconfigured armor configuration that had sloped armor, which was better. It replaced the Wright Whirlwind aircraft engine that was in the M3, both that, different sizes, but in the M3 medium and the initial M4 tanks. It replaced those with twin Cadillac engines, which were much easier to maintain. Bottom left is the M3 medium tank, which the British called our variant the Lee. And on the right is a comparison of the M3 and a prototype M4. I'm just going to call them Shermans. A lot of people did in theater. And you can tell it's a prototype because if you can see, there are 2 holes in the lower hull where they were going to put in 2 more machine guns. Next slide, please. I'm going to also mention the assault guns because they wound up having, I think, an outsized impact considering their number. only 6 of them in the reorganized standard battalion. Upper left is the T-30. That's a 105 millimeter howitzer on the M3 half-track. To the right is an armored field artillery piece, and that's the M7 Priest, which was a stopgap that was used both in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific. Lower left is the M8 assault gun with a 75 millimeter howitzer, the turret of which went on one of the AM tanks. And the bottom right is the M4A3 howitzer tank. Next slide, please. So yeah, it's my thing, right, Chieftain? Yeah, the Army's Navy. So in 1943, the Armored Force changed names twice. It became the Armored Command, and then the Armored Center. I'm just going to call it the Armored Force most of the time.
I do as well.
Yeah. So anyway, but the Armored Command reorganized 9 battalions into amphibian tractor and amphibian tank battalions. And the difference between amphibian and amphibious in the tank world is that amphibious tanks, like the DD tanks, could traverse water, but that, like, on a one-way trip. They didn't go back out to sea, whereas amphibians were at home on land and sea. Anyway, these, of course, were intended for the Pacific theater, and they pulled battalions, field artillery battalions, a range of different ones to set these things up, armored infantry. The AM tank battalion had 4 companies, initially with 17 AM tanks, and they got one more later, and a headquarters company. The Amtrak battalion had 2 companies with 51 Amtraks. That also reorganized later, and a headquarters and service company. Next slide, please. And here we have our armored amphibians. Well, the upper left is the LVT-1 T-33. LVT is landing vehicle tracked, and that was Navy terminology that everybody just adopted. The first one was unarmored, and the tracks were very fragile. The Marines used these at Tarawa and the Army at Macon. And the Marines suffered terribly because the machine gunners in the vehicle had no protection, and bullets just went right through the sides. On the right is an LVT-2. There was an armored version and an unarmored version. I won't show it, but there was an LVT-4 that came into service, and the difference was it had a ramp on the back, so the infantry didn't have to jump over the sides under fire. Lower left is the LVT-A1 AM tank. It has an M5 turret on an armored LVT chassis. And if you look, you can just see on the back there are 2 machine gun positions on the sides. They were called scarf guns, and they were vitally important against the Japanese in holding off infantry close assaults. And then on the right is the LVT-A4 AM tank, which has the open-top turret of the M8 assault gun with a 75 millimeter. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to say that the separate tank battalions were the bedrock of the armored force, just on sheer numbers and diversity. 1942, there were 26. Mid-1943, there were 41. By 1944, there were 65, plus one separate tank company. I'm not going to talk about them. 7 AmTank and 23 Amtrak battalions, while the armored divisions had only 54 battalions. Next slide, please. So doctrine, to which I say...
I like your spelling.
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned earlier, doctrine was designed for the armored divisions, and again, you can see why. But the separate tank battalions had to work inside infantry doctrine, and there was no account taken of that. The field manual of May 1941 had 2 pages on infantry cooperation with tanks, and my favorite quote was, "Tanks should not be tied too closely to foot troops," which is wrong. So 1942, when the tactics manual came out finally, it had 10 sentences on tank infantry cooperation. So when I say that they had to develop this on the battlefield, it's really true. I mean, the first manual on tank infantry cooperation came out in 1943, by which time most of the divisions and battalions that were going to be fighting in Europe and the Pacific were already overseas, so they couldn't use the thing. So really all doctrine that was used in practice that mattered was developed in the field. The amphibians adopted Marine doctrine, and they were standing up more or less simultaneously, and the Marines had no doctrine either. They had Navy doctrine on using landing craft. So the Marines were concocting a doctrine from scratch as well, and the Army just took whatever they did. Next slide, please. So Wayne Robinson was a tanker with the 743rd, and I just really liked his summary of what a separate battalion did. The separate tank battalion fought at the foot soldiers' pace. Its job was to give the doughboys attack the added punch, to bowl ahead when the going got rough, to knock down houses, to stop enemy tanks. Often the doughboy regiment and the attached tank battalion slugged it out with the Jerrys on the line for days and really weeks and months, inching painfully ahead to engineer an opening for the armored divisions. And that was pretty much what happened, at least when tanks and infantry cooperated in all theaters of war. Next slide, please.
I would put a note here that your use of the doughboys, and you do it in the book a lot, is you will refer to the grunts as doughs and not GIs or grunts or PBIs or anything else that we call them today, crunchies.
Right. Okay. So nobody during the war called soldiers GIs. That's a post-war retrofit. Tankers always called them doughboys or doughs. TD people always called them doughboys or doughs. And when you read first-person accounts from infantry officers, they typically also refer to doughboys and doughs. So that's a part of the World War II lingo that has simply been lost to history.
Yeah, it's the same. The fire command. If you look at the fire commands for the Sherman or for the tank at the time, where we today would say troops, in World War II the commander would say doughs.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. So training. Most of the battalions trained as if they were part of an armored division, especially the battalions that separated out from armored divisions, which kept them for training. And almost no infantry divisions trained with tanks or vice versa, except for amphibious operations. The tankers didn't get training in a lot of the things they were going to have to do. The Pacific battalions got a little better preparation because they had to go through the infantry jungle warfare training center. So they at least sort of had a concept of what their infantry partners were going to be doing. But training was really a mess. So next slide, please. So we're gonna start the war in the Philippines.
Well, let's take a break here, and we'll have a quick discussion on the background, then look for questions from the audience. I guess the idea of the first question that comes to mind, I guess, or comment, is your point that there's only 2 pages or so in the manual for the infantry cooperation. Yes, as you mentioned, infantry branch controlled tanks for the previous 20 years. So I guess the question is, what on earth were they doing that they didn't bother writing anything in the manual? Or do you think the Armored Force just threw it out?
I guess the Armored Force paid no attention to it. It was a brand new entity, and the infantry had no control over it at all.
The other thing, the idea of having infantry tanks or infantry rolled tanks, I guess is probably a better way of putting it, versus exploitation tanks, that's not unique to the US. So you look at the British infantry tanks, Matilda, Churchill, or even the Soviets, for example, the T-26 originally an infantry tank. Mm-hmm. Yet the Americans used exactly the same vehicles and formation. An armored division battalion and an infantry division battalion are exactly identical. Do you think that was just a matter of rationalization, or was there anything else behind it?
I would think it was a matter of rationalization, but if with 2020 hindsight, the tanks that we went to war with, the medium tanks, were designed for infantry support. They had a 75 millimeter main gun that fired a very effective HE round, but had modest armor-piercing capabilities. I mean, it was quite fine for 1941, 1942, 1943. It was an even match with the Mark IV. But
it was the best tank gun that the Americans could fit into a tank. I mean, even the tank destroyers had the same 75 millimeter gun. In fact, the tank destroyers has an older one.
Right. But the Army never set about trying to get a better tank killer for the exploitation forces because, in part, doctrine said tank destroyers were supposed to be taking care of that job. And so, of course, as we will see and we know, it wasn't until everybody had to deal with Panthers that people got spooked and wanted a better gun for armor piercing.
Yeah. You did mention in the book also a couple of little exceptions. The whole tanks aren't supposed to fight tanks. I mean, my definition of infantry support is you have a tank next to the infantry to deal with whatever the infantry is facing. And that can include tanks if the enemy has brought tanks along.
Sure, and the doctrine did allow for that if enemy armor appeared, tanks would engage. But the overall doctrine was a preference that tanks... Well, of course, again, the doctrine was written for armored divisions. The preference was in doctrine that tanks exploit and tank destroyers kill tanks. But everybody realized that tanks were going to have to fight tanks.
So just going through the background here, Dionysicus, M3 Stuart, M3 Lee, M3 gun motor carriage, not confusing at all, he says. The T-30, by the way, you said it was 105. I think that was a 75 pack howitzer. Scrolling down to see what else said. Did they use the CDLs at Remagen? I don't think they did. I think it was just...
I think Remagen was one of the places they dragged a couple out because they were worried about German scuba divers blowing up the bridge. So they put some up on the bank to shine the spotlights down on the river.
Priests were converted to troop carriers, at least in the British Army. They were called defrocked priests. I don't think the Americans ever turned their... There was no American kangaroo equivalent or anything, was there?
No, not to my knowledge.
Yeah. Every time somebody types something in, my screen goes backwards. M3 submachine gun. Did they try a turret bigger than the M3, M5s on Amtracs? I do know they tried a Chafee turret. Because I said, of course,
that wasn't available till so late in the war, it wouldn't have mattered. And there was an LVT-5 that came out after the war that I'm not actually sure what they put on top of that since I've never looked at those battalions.
What was the one that had the 75 millimeter from the M8 motor carriage?
That was the LVT-A4.
Yeah, okay. So the one that had the Stuart with the 37 was the A2?
A1.
A1.
Yeah, it is totally confusing. Yeah, totally confusing.
Squishies. Yes, I have squishies. Code, so just lots of stuff down here. Why don't they shoot our tanks? Okay. What's your opinion? Is a tank a he, a she, or an it?
Whoa. Well, a lot of them were named after women, so I suppose that you can make a case for she. I don't know what they called it. And
mine was an it. My platoon sergeant was a she, and his wingman was very adamant that his tank was male.
Oh, okay.
Does modern tank doctrine hail more from the separate tank battalions than the armored divisions? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. What happened after the war is that tank battalions became organic to infantry divisions. And as time passed, by the time of the Gulf War, an infantry division pretty much had as much tanks as an armored division. I mean, they were more or less the same in functionality. So it was infantry divisions that led the armored spearheads in Iraq.
Yeah, that's true. But really, the only difference between an infantry division and an armored division in the Cold War era was just how many battalions of each you had.
Yeah.
And the Americans looked at it took a little bit longer, but pretty much every army has started with too many tanks in the tank division compared to the infantry. Question from von Richthofen 555. On page 6 of your book, it says, quote, "The idea that medium tanks should lead the advance into the teeth of strong anti-tank defenses also proved a bloody failure. Pardon my ignorance, but what's the logic behind attacking frontally an anti-tank position with tanks?"
Well, again, I say to doctrine, no, it makes no sense. Now, the irony of this is that after talking to the chieftain earlier this evening, who it turns out served in an armored unit that was the lineal descendant of the 194th Tank Battalion from the National Guard that we'll talk about in just a minute. One of the incidents that happened on Luzon with the 194th, they deployed south of Manila with South Force, and the infantry had no idea what to do with them. And on the day after Christmas, an infantry officer sent the 2nd Platoon of Company C down a road, told them they'd run into nothing except small arms fire, and they ran into a roadblock with an anti-tank gun and several artillery pieces. And the anti-tank gun knocked the lead tank out, and the second tank went around it and ran over the anti-tank gun. And I have to say, there's a statue to this. Is that right?
There's actually a monument. Actually, I think there's two. There's one in the Philippines, I think, but there is a reenactment or a memorial in Camp Roberts, California.
To my knowledge, that's the only incident that ever happened with somebody actually running over an anti-tank gun.
But that was actually the official doctrine.
Yes, it was. And it's what the 1st Armored Division first tried in North Africa. And they lost a lot of tanks doing it.
Around 194th. I'm just trying to see if I can bring this up here. German C Company. So yeah, in my case, it was the California unit in question that I was in was first of the 149th Armor, which 194th was the actual unit that went to the Philippines. But that was a conglomeration of a company from California, Salinas, a company from Minnesota, a company from here and there. And they had probably the highest loss rate of any unit of any sort in the war.
Yeah, they lost something like 550 people, but most of them were actually killed in captivity.
Yeah, no, they didn't come home.
No.
I guess is the bottom line.
Yes.
There was another line, and you quoted it, and I've seen it quoted so many times as well. It was along the lines of, and I think it's also on page 6. It was on the lines of if you are facing a superior enemy armored. Oh, here it is. Again, it was on page 8. Against equal or superior hostile armored forces, friendly armored units will avoid frontal assault and maneuver instead. And people are looking at that saying, yeah, that's evidence that you should not attack tanks with another tank. I'm going, against superior enemy forces, what manual for anything says attack? I can't remember. You talk about the assault tanks in here, though, right? The jumbos?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Not much.
So, yeah, that would have been the answer to how do you attack into the teeth of strong anti-tank defenses.
Right.
Okay, so the 3rd company from the 194th was Missouri. And yes, 895, all 191 to 194 were all National Guard units.
Correct. And all of them were conglomerations of companies from individual National Guard divisions around the country.
Yep. Okay, well, let's go on. I don't see any other comments in here, so let's go on to the Philippines. Talk about the 194th.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Okay, so if you can see this map, what we're going to be talking about is all up in the northwest corner there. There's Lingayen Gulf, where the main Japanese landing took place. And there are a couple of towns up there, Agu, for example. That's where the 192nd Tank Battalion engaged Japanese tanks for the first time in the war. And you can see down then Manila a bit farther south with Bataan and Corregidor. So next slide, please. The armored force engaged the enemy within 24 hours of Pearl Harbor, which is fairly amazing. When the two National Guard tank battalions arrived in the Philippines, the 192nd and 194th, they deployed around Clark Field, where the American plan was to protect the aircraft that were lined up in neat rows against sabotage, so that the Japanese Navy could blow them up later when they did their airstrikes. In any event, on that very first day, the Japanese bombed Clark Field, and one of the tankers shot down a Zero that flew right over him. So he got the first armored force kill of the war, and the 196th Second Tank Battalion lost a man killed in action. So that was the first armored force death in the war. Next slide, please. So when they arrived, they were not issued ammunition or things you might do to train. They had brand new M3 tanks. They'd trained on the M2A2 in the United States, and they could do very little to learn their new vehicles. The tanks were heavier, so they had different capabilities and terrain. They fired their guns for the very first time in battle, and they found their guns jamming, including their machine guns. It was a micro picture of an American army that wasn't really ready for war. So when the Japanese landed at Lingayen Gulf, the 192nd Tank Battalion was sent up that way to hook up with the Philippine scouts around Agu, and the 194th Battalion was sent south. I'm not going to talk about them. We already had an anecdote. But again, preparation, by the time they got close to Agu, they didn't have enough fuel to send anything more than a single platoon up to meet the Japanese. Those 5 tanks tangled with Japanese medium tanks. Their 37 rounds bounced off the enemy tanks. The 47 rounds penetrated theirs, and all the vehicles were destroyed. Not a very good first fight for the armored force. Fuel finally reached the rest of the battalion, and they were ordered to screen the retreat of all forces in the north to the Bataan Peninsula. And if you read the book, there are some, again, pretty great stories about what it was like screening a retreat, which was not part of any armored doctrine. It was a whole new thing that they simply had to work out in the field. By the time the 2 battalions arrived at Bataan, they'd lost about half their tanks already. And it was only after the siege began that the army started engaging in some tank infantry training with every single infantry battalion. As we know, the story ended badly with the Bataan Death March. Next slide, please. This picture is of one of the 192nd Battalion's tanks with the Philippine Scouts. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move to the Mediterranean, just to bounce around because all of these landings are going to come up. Down in the
North Gamely's wondering what is screening the retreat. I have a video up on both the World of Tanks. It's on the World of Tanks channel anyway. It's called "Defending the Philippines," and I go into fairly good detail on the various operations of the armored units there. So I could tell you, if you watch that video, it'll tell you what unit was screening for what and who was playing rear guard. Oh no, he's asking what actually is screening. Okay, so covering is a good answer.
Okay.
you asked me what is screening. I'm going to tell you what unit, not what it actually is. Okay, no questions on the Philippines on this. So onward to Torch.
Okay, so southwest corner of the map, you see the landings in Torch. The landings were spread out over a lot of miles. Task Force West landed in Morocco. Task Force East landed from Oran east to Algiers. Then the next landing will be Sicily, Operation Husky in July. Then the Operation Avalanche at Salerno over there in September. Operation Shingle at Anzio in January of 44, and then Operation Dragoon in August of 44, just to look down the road. Next slide, please.
So the Army did so many more amphibious landings than the Marine Corps did.
Well, I mean, yeah. So North Africa for the separate battalions was only sort of a hint of the future. They didn't play a very big role in that campaign. So the landings were on the 8th of November, and the only thing the Allies knew about storming a defended shore was the operation at Dieppe, when a Canadian brigade went in, supported by Churchill tanks. And it was generally a fiasco. But the lesson they came away with was you had to have the tanks with the infantry right at the very start of a landing on a hostile shore. Now,
I think you said went there, wasn't it? He went actually on part of the invasion.
I'm sorry, who?
Truscott?
Yes. And apparently that had a big impact on his input into the Operation Torch planning. Only light tanks could be landed with the infantry at the time of of Torch, and they could be landed in lighters, which were essentially landing craft with a ramp, like was used later in the war, or from Maricaibos, which were converted oil tankers. They couldn't land on the beach. They had to lay down a pontoon bridge, but at least you could get a light tank on the shore pretty quickly. Medium tanks had to be lifted out of the hold of a tanker and deposited on a dock. So that's why it was only light tanks that went in. The two battalions that landed were the 70th and the 756th, and they were both light. Next slide, please. So one company landed with each regiment of the 9th Infantry Division, and they were spread all the way from Algiers to the west. I mean, it was a kind of crazy thing, but they wanted an American unit to land with the British, so it looked like an Anglo-American force and not just a British force, which might severely piss off the French. And I like, as a professional analyst, I always like dogs that didn't bark, or the case where something didn't happen. What did it tell you? And we know what happens if you don't have tanks, because Company A of the 70th showed up late because their transport ship was torpedoed and they had to move slowly, and a few French tanks were able to hold up the 39th Infantry Regiment. And if they'd gotten a company of tanks on the shore with them, that wouldn't have happened. The other 70th Tank Battalion, before I move on to the 756, landed at Port Liaudi, and they did a range of things that looked very much like you'd expect a separate tank battalion to do. They drove off French tanks when the French tanks showed up and attacked. They supported the infantry assault on the airfield, and they dispersed two French infantry companies that they happened to come upon. Next slide, please. And that's a 70th Tank Battalion at the airport. Next slide, please.
Direction of the flag, guys, for people that like complaining about the flags being the wrong way around on things. All the World War II photos, you see the Union, it's in as we would ordinarily expect, but no, it was always you reversed it, so it's flying
to the rear.
Yeah, no, not in World War II. They didn't care about that.
I guess not.
So, hey, we're not English, please don't shoot at us, was basically the gist of it.
Yes, exactly. So the 756 landed at Fidala, and they instantly Well, first off, the Navy screwed up the landing. I mean, this was the
bollocks.
Yeah, bollocks. The assault wave, for example, started off heading out to sea instead of pointing towards shore. That was just the first sign of some trouble. And very few units landed where they were supposed to be at the time they were supposed to. But 5 M5s did land where they were supposed to, and the infantry immediately commandeered them and said, "We need you to go into Fadala to help us knock out French guns." And the platoon commander said, "Well, Armoured doctrine frowns on tanks going into towns." And the infantry said, "We need the tanks, you're going." So that again was a lesson that was going to come up time and time again. It didn't matter. They actually talked about doctrine. It didn't matter what the doctrine said. What mattered was what the infantry needed. So they were very effective, went into Fadala, knocked out guns. Okay, next slide. So, as I said, the separate tank battalions were mainly out of the war, but in large part because of logistics. The entire logistics chain to Tunisia was a rickety French colonial railroad line, and all they could support at the far end of that was the 1st Armored Division and one company of the 70th Tank Battalion, which was attached to the French. And again, you really need to read the book. I don't have time to talk about them, but that was just a fascinating story. It's unbelievable. In 1943, we talked about the tank destroyer groups. The tank groups had the same thing, and the 1st tank group showed up from the UK with 3 battalions in tow, but they had nothing really to do, and the 1st Armored Division was losing so many tanks in Tunisia that they stripped 54 medium tanks and sent them to Tunisia. So what got the separate battalions back into the war was the Germans and the Battle of Kasserine. We don't need to talk about that because our guys weren't there. But as you know, the Germans pretty much kicked the 1st Armored Division apart. They lost a lot of tanks. And as a consequence, 4th Armored Group, 1st Tank Group, pooled tanks and sent the 751st Tank Battalion to the front, where they joined up with the 34th Infantry Division in Stuka Valley. And they were bombed the very first day they got there. Everybody hid under their tanks, and somebody must have told them that was stupid. And the next day when the Germans came back, everybody shot at them with the machine guns on the tank, and they never returned. Next slide, please. So here's a map of Tunisia. The only places that interest us are smack in the middle of the map there, Fondouk Pass and Bizerti up on the north coast. Those are the 2 places that we'll see. Okay, next slide, please. So the Allied line at this time was a higgledy-piggledy mess of national units intermixed all along the front. And the 34th Infantry Division was subordinated to the British 9 Corps, which was attacking Fondouk Pass. The Germans had pulled back from Kasserine once that offensive burned out, back to the mountains. And the Allies needed to get through the pass. So the 751st Tank Battalion arrives, and the infantry clearly has no idea what to do with them. The infantry attacks on its own without any tank support, and the Germans pin them down with machine gun fire. Then the tanks are called, and the tanks show up and attack as an entire battalion. And this is a very rare event in the history of the separate tank battalions. They attacked together in a wedge, and they didn't do too badly. They blew up as many German anti-tank guns as they could see, but they paid no attention to the machine gun nests. So they reached the objective twice, but the infantry couldn't get to them because the machine guns were still there. So, the failure was taking place on both sides of this relationship. And the battalion lost 16 tanks to AT fire and landmines. So there they were charging into the face of anti-tank guns. Next slide, please. There's an M3 firing its gun. Next slide, please. So up in Bizerti, Eisenhower reorganized his front and concentrated American Second Corps up on the coast, and so the tank battalion was assigned to join the push to Bizerti, and the first order it received from the 9th Infantry Division, which had worked with tanks at Torch but had forgotten everything about it, was to do a reconnaissance in force with tank destroyers and seize a hill and hold it. And again, it showed absolutely no understanding of what a tank is capable of doing. They sent no infantry. And then to cap it all off, they sent the tanks on their own into Bizerti without any infantry. And they wound up just hooking up with some French infantry that were in the city and helping them blow out diehards. I mean, so anyway, that's a picture of an M3 actually in Bizerti. Next slide, please. So do you want to take a break?
Yeah, let's take a quick break there. Just going back on a couple of things here. Hello, Aaron. Aaron is a former Marine Corps tanker. And somebody was asking, okay, so for the other one who was asking about the Marines getting rid of tanks, Bloody Goaty, come back to us next month when I'm talking to Ken Estes about the book Marines Under Armor. He's already been prepared for that question because we know he's going to talk about it. Ricky Palacios, wasn't there an engagement with M3 Light and French R-35s? I think that was the one that you were talking about at the airfield.
Right.
Cynicomatic. After the doctrine was effectively disproven as viable in the field, how long did it take for the doctrine to change officially? I think it was after the war. Well, officially?
Because that's when the manual came out.
But
the doctrine that emerged on the battlefield, the real doctrine was not reflected in a manual until 1944, when the roles of the Separate Tank Battalion, for example, were laid out pretty clearly, and everything that had been learned in the various theaters were folded into the package.
Okay, I'll do more digging. The Armored Force Manual, the basic field manual was 1942, and there wasn't another one, but maybe at lower levels. There was what influence did Patton have to tank doctrine? Very little.
Well, actually, Patton in World War I wrote the infantry support doctrine for tanks, and so that's what the infantry was basically using between the wars. So, in a sense,
they threw it away.
Well, yeah. Well,
down to 2 pages.
Well, yes and no, right? The Armored Force threw it away, but there were a lot of infantry officers in the Armored Force, and if you look at Fedala, for example, the local infantry commander was using tanks kind of like in World War I. He said, we got to get these tanks in there with the infantry and fight side by side, and that's what Patton had written.
Yeah, but everybody else from World War I, though. So anyway, what do you think of the post-war decision to integrate a tank company into infantry regimental combat teams?
Good idea.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that as well, because I think that's early post-war. Given that the separate battalions seldom worked as intact battalions, how widely separated would the companies be geographically? And I guess the follow-on question to that is, how would they get supported logistically?
Right.
And maintenance?
Well, as we'll see, typically a tank company was farmed out to every regiment, and the tank platoon to every battalion. So they were as geographically dispersed as an infantry division was dispersed. Being serviced was somewhat difficult, and The book actually has some stories from the logistical side of it, of just how insanely dangerous it was to drive trucks full of gasoline and ammunition up to tanks that couldn't pull back to refuel and rearm. So yeah, it was a mess, but somehow they managed to do it.
In my experience, infantry commanders have no idea how much fuel and maintenance a tank requires. There's a story I was talking to one guy, said, "Oh yeah, we're being attached to an infantry unit for actually an amphibious landing," and they're asked, "Well, how much fuel do you need?" I said, "Oh, we need maybe 4,000 gallons a day," and the a day bit was missed. And they thought it was 4,000 gallons for the full 2-week exercise. So there was enough gas for the tanks to land, drive around for a day, and that was it. They were out of it for the rest of the exercise.
Wow.
There's a little anecdote in your book about it was the XO of a light tank company that killed a tiger by luring it onto some mines and then shooting it repeatedly in the back until it blew up.
Well, that was the only way to kill a tiger with a Sherman, was to shoot it repeatedly.
Oh no, it was the light tank company, so it was 37.
Oh, light tank.
But I always say that the official statistics, real life doesn't care what they are.
Yeah.
Because you can get a weak shot, you can get a lucky shot, whatever. You fire enough rounds at it, but there we go. Hello, Ed, up at Armoured Archives. Okay, I guess we move on to Sicily. Kilo 19 says he had a similar experience working with infantry. Okay. No. Sicily, on we go.
All right, Sicily will be short.
Okay, we'll do this in Italy at once then.
Say again?
We'll just do this in Italy in one fell swoop.
Okay. Operation Husky, 10 July 1943. So the U.S. 7th Army there's going to be a map in a second. This will make sense. The 7th Army landed to the left, the British to the right, and a completely separate beachhead. So there was no plan of them linking up anytime soon. The Brits would drive up the east coast and the Americans up through the center of the island, and they would converge on the northeast corner. The Axis defense plan anticipated all this, and they engaged in stage delaying actions all the way back, and ultimately successfully evacuated all of their troops from the island without any real interference. So Patton, in planning for 7th Army, refused to take any tank destroyers to the island because he thought they'd done a bad job in North Africa. And no tanks were assigned to the assault wave. This wasn't entirely Patton's fault, because there was an overall Allied ban for some reason on putting tanks in the assault wave. And this despite the fact that half the American force was going to be landing in brand new LCTs and LSTs, which in theory could reach the beach, though as it turned out there was a false beach in the American landing zone, and they had to transfer ultimately the tanks with smaller boats or pontoon bridges to get them on land. In any event, it was also a peculiar operation because the 2nd Armored Division had 2 combat commands assigned to provide the support a separate tank battalion would normally support, until the division pulled into reserve and got ready to make the big dash to Palermo, as it turned out. The only small cheat here was that Lucian Truscott, whose entire landing force was coming in landing craft, somehow made it possible to get some tanks ashore immediately after the last infantryman set foot on it. So the 753rd Tank Battalion landed with the 45th Infantry Division on the far right, and it was supposed to deploy 10 tanks to join the 1st Infantry in the center until their tanks showed up. I already said that. Okay, next slide, please.
There's a comment on there, you didn't mention it, but how they use an armored division an armored division battalion to act as a independent battalion. And I think later you talked about it going the other way as well. Okay, you going to bed?
Yeah, that's true, but apparently apparently they decided it was a bad idea to use an armored division that way, and it was never tried again. In any event, so the 70th Tank Battalion was also coming ashore. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here's Sicily. The American landing beaches are on the south coast, about halfway over on the island, and the British landed on that point down on the far right-hand corner. Next slide, please. Now, the problem with the plan in bringing tanks to shore was that the Axis had plenty of tanks, and they immediately counterattacked the landing with the Livorno Division, which was a mechanized division with tanks, and the Hermann Goering Panzer Division, which was not fully formed yet. It didn't have its full complement of tanks, but it had a company of Army Tigers with it. And the first attacks hit the infantry. They had no tank destroyers. They had no tanks, and they had to fight this off with close action. Grenades, bazookas. We had field artillery firing over open sights, which is never a good tactical situation. And at Gala, naval gunfire broke up an armored attack. The first friendly tanks, despite the plan, did not reach the infantry until D+1. And again, you saw the infantry using tanks in ways that made no sense at all. The 45th Division sent the 753rd Tank Battalion to capture an airfield and hold it until the infantry arrived. I mean, it was just nuts. Company A reached the infantry just as, well, it was just before the Hermann Goering Panzer Division counterattacked it on D+4. And that was a time when a Sherman killed a Tiger from the rear when the Germans gave up on the attack and were leaving. But the price was that the other Tiger punched 2 rounds through the front armor of the Sherman and destroyed it. With the 70th Tank Battalion, this gets to that light tank point that you made, Chieftain. The battalion commander sees this large force of German medium tanks coming his way, and he knows his light tanks can't shoot it out with them. So he deployed them up onto high ground on both sides of the road, and they fired along with the 105s on the T-30s from the high ground, and reportedly were sort of using tank destroyer tactics. They'd fire a couple rounds, pull back, pop up at another place. But it turned out that wasn't really necessary because the Germans couldn't raise their guns far enough to hit any of them. Anyway, they knocked out 9 medium tanks, and as somebody said, getting back to doctrine, that's not in the book. Next slide, please. So the upper picture is a tank in Sicily. That's what it was, mountains everywhere. That is obviously an armored division, 2nd Armored Division tank, because it's not an M4A1. The lower right is one of the Separate Tank Battalion tanks, and that was the first use. It has the welded hull. That's the difference. You can see the slab armor, and let me point out that's a pretty good picture because you can really see there the shot trap that the hatches on the front armor created. Less so on the welded hull, but still there's crap up there that can snag an AP round. Next slide, please. So fighting in the mountainous terrain, I think I mentioned earlier that a tanker in Italy said that your front is 1 tank wide. It's a terribly difficult thing. Certainly, very few tanks can work with the infantry in mountain, and it's all going to be on roads. Now, the 753rd was with the 45th Division, and the 1st Infantry Division was with the 1st Infantry Division. And what was interesting was they quickly realized that it made no sense to have all your light tanks in one place and all your medium tanks somewhere else. And the battalions cross-attached a company to each other. So there would always be some light tanks which could go places medium tanks couldn't go, and there would always be medium tanks to provide the punch a light tank wouldn't have. The 1st Infantry Division took a while to work their partnership with the 70th, but it turned out pretty well. They learned to work up front with the light tanks, right with the infantry, hold the medium tanks back on overwatch and supporting fire, and they gradually, even though they had no means of communication other than talking to each other, they worked out a good relationship. And by the end of the month of combat, Terry de la Mesa Allen, who was the division commander, referred to it as an intimate relationship. And I think this is important because it showed that it took close to a month for people to work this out, for the infantry and the tankers to work this out. And the timeline was perhaps a little shorter in the European theater, but not all that much shorter. So when you think about the School of Hard Knocks, and the fact that tank battalions typically lost a big share of their losses for the entire war in the first 2 weeks of combat, somewhere in that 2 week to 4 week period, things started to gel just because they had to learn to do it right.
I think this is a good, I'm sure you probably mention it in the future anyway, but this is a good point to reinforce the way that the tankers and the infantry would talk to each other on the battlefield. Was basically somebody would stand up in front of the tank, do this, and point.
Right. And you'd have to get up on the tank and talk to the tank commander in his turret, or he'd have to get down and talk to you. I mean, in a high-intensity battle, or on a high-intensity battlefield like Normandy, that was a recipe for disaster. I'm sure that the pace of combat in Sicily was typically slow enough that you had opportunities to have that kind of battlefield conversation that you wouldn't have fighting in a hedgerow for your life. Anyway, this was the last campaign ever where infantry divisions lacked for tanks. Next slide, please. All right, Italy. More tanks, more mountains. So, the story is going to be very similar there, except for 4 times when the tank battalions were able to play a truly meaningful role. Salerno, Cassino, Anzio in the final offensive into the Po Valley. I'm going to briefly talk about the first 3 and not the last. But otherwise, the official army history said that tanks were often a liability rather than an asset. And so that was the problem with Italy. Next slide, please. Here's a map of Italy. So again, the 3 places we're going to talk about, Salerno down just above the foot of the boot, Anzio up near Rome, and Cassino is sort of due east of there. Next slide, please. So despite the fact that the Americans had landed in Sicily without any tanks and immediately been counterattacked by a panzer division and a mechanized division, the plan for the landing at Salerno didn't have any tanks landing with the infantry. The plan anticipated that only 10 M4s would join the 35th Division, which was the assault division, at daybreak. 10. And they knew that the defending force was going to be the 16th Panzer Division, and they knew that tank counterattacks were very likely early in the day. No TDs were scheduled to come in until the evening. Well, lo and behold, armored counterattacks started at dawn, and one attack overran part of an infantry division. A second attack pinned an entire I'm sorry, I said division, an entire regiment, part of a regiment. A second attack pinned a regiment down for the entire day, and a third attack was stopped only half a mile from the beach by direct fire by artillery. Again, field artillery firing over iron sights, which is never a good tactical position to be in. And oddly enough, the cavalry reconnaissance troop for the 35th Division had picked up some surplus M6 tank destroyers with 37 millimeter guns and actually knocked out a couple of tanks with them. It's odd. Read the book. Anyway, more attacks came, and they were held off by the usual bazookas, grenades, and naval gunfire. Next slide, please. So here's the landing area. I am only going to point out up at the north side, there's a river there called the Selle River, which I'll mention briefly. But otherwise, that's high ground to the east of the landing area that the infantry moved up and tried to kick the Germans out. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the 191st Tank Battalion landing from LST. So they at least finally got to use those the way they were supposed to be used. Next slide, please. So the 751st was the tank battalion that was supposed to get 10 tanks ashore at daybreak, and they actually got 2 tanks in the battle on D-Day. One managed to knock out a couple of Mark IVs, but then it was destroyed. And the rest of the battalion came in on D+1. Again, you know, it wasn't they should have been better at this because they'd landed twice, but the ship to shore was just chaotic at this landing. Company C fired artillery missions, and that's a bit interesting because it's the first time that we see a separate tank battalion doing that. And the rest of the battalion was scattered across the entire 36th Division sector, which at that time, it was the only division ashore. The 45th Division started coming in. The 191st actually managed to get a lot of its tanks on shore, but not until the afternoon. And they moved up to that river, the Selle River, and destroyed 8 German tanks. They stayed in place, and the 45th Division moved into the left part of the sector. The 36th Division consolidated on the right side on D+1. And again, you see the infantry totally misusing tanks. The division ordered Company B to cross the river on D+2 and head north and find out what was there. And they ran into an ambush, lost 7 tanks, and 4 killed in action, 13 missing in action. Next slide, please. So the Germans reacted by taking armored units that had been down facing the British landing on the Toe and rushing them up to the American beachhead, as well as bringing in the 15th Panzer Grenadier and Hermann Goering Division to face the British landing. And when the Germans once again immediately attacked with their new forces, and they almost reached the beach again. In fact, this was the only American beachhead where the commander considered abandoning it. The situation was so grim. More attacks came on the 13th. And the 45th Division was still uncertain what to do with its tanks. They got very vague orders. So in this case, the battalion commander, on his own authority, arranged his tanks in a semicircle facing all directions in the 45th Division area, and put his assault guns in the middle of this semicircle and all the ammunition so tanks could back out individually and rearm and move back up. And they fended off 2 armored attacks on each of their flanks. And I found it kind of interesting that when we talk about the battle in Rocherat during the the Battle of the Bulge, that they used exactly the same semicircle arrangement against armored attacks. And it wasn't doctrine, but it was a field solution that seemed to work. The 36th Division told the 751st Tank Battalion, stop tank attacks. That was it, and there were none. Next slide, please. So here's I suspect, 191st Battalion tank, since it's next to a destroyed Mark IV. Next slide, please. Well, Kesselring gave up after a few days of this and ordered his troops to start a long withdrawal up the Italian peninsula. And the entire Italian campaign, it involved Kesselring moving from prepared position to prepared position entirely on his own schedule, and letting the Allies beat themselves bloody against his fortified lines until he decided to move to the next stopping point. And there was an assessment after Salerno looking at how the tanks were used. And it was kind of interesting. So, as I mentioned, the 751st Tank Battalion was basically out of the battle, dispersed across the battlefield. And the observer said, you know, maybe these tank battalions in a situation like this should be subordinated to the Corps, and the Corps then could move them around to deal with the attacks that are coming in. But nobody ever pursued this. There will be observer reports later that have a clear or fairly clear impact on the way the Army handles armor. But nobody did anything with this. Next slide, please.
It's what the purpose of the tank destroyer unit was for, to have a TD group at Corps level and move around to wherever the attacks were. Yeah, but of course that didn't ever happen either. So Battle of Cassino was the first real urban fight. And, you know, to sort of summarize the situation there, this was the linchpin of the Gustav line, in the American sector at least. And it never fell. The Germans eventually pulled out, and various armies took a shot at it, but nobody could capture it. However, the Americans got into Cassino, and we're going to briefly look at how that happened, because it's a great battlefield solution to the problem, and it showed how it really actually shows how the infantry and tank side started to work together on the field. Next slide, please. So January 1944. I said, read the book. It's full of great stuff about this operation. This is going to be nothing but the surface. So the hero in this story is Lieutenant Colonel Harry Sweeting, who commands the 756th Tank Battalion. And, you know, he's dealt with infantry that had no idea what to do with his tanks. So now he's attached to the 34th Infantry Division, which is supposed to cross the Rapido River and get into Cassino. And the ground for tanks is just awful, but he's supposed to support this attack. So what does he do? Well, the first thing he does, well before the operation, is he orders his company commanders to establish liaison and communication with the infantry battalion COs well before the action. Get to know your infantry partner. And he sent radio-equipped liaisons along to infantry and battalion headquarters, so you could actually talk at least at that command level, right? And battalion level action is where the action really is in tank infantry cooperation. So second, to be clear, if you're a squad leader and you say, "Oh crap, we need tanks," you talk to your platoon talks to company talks to battalion, who then walks across to the guy sitting in the Jeep with the tank radio, who then gets on to the company commander of the tank company that could be right next to the squad leader.
Oh, of course, if the squad leader is right there, he can go talk to the tank commander. And close communication between the two parties on the battlefield is part of this package. But, I mean, this is a step forward. never before has somebody set up communication between a tank battalion and its infantry partners. And, you know, it's frickin' January 1944, all right? Okay, so, and he brought the engineers in. Can you build me a way to get my tanks to the river and across the river? Because there's no way right now. And the engineers tried on the first day of the offensive. It didn't really work out. Tanks got stuck. It was a bit of a mess. But they kept at it. They kept trying, and they worked at it until it would happen. The infantry's on the other side of the river, pinned down. They can't move anywhere. But when the tanks come across, the tanks advance, crush barbed wire, explode the anti-personnel mines, and the infantry rises up and follows in the tank tracks. And all of a sudden, you have a tank infantry force heading towards Casino. The Germans never thought tanks could be here, so there's no real anti-tank defense, which probably makes it easier for this battlefield cross-communication to be taking place. They work well together as they approach. The infantry identifies targets, the tanks take the targets, and so on. When they get into the city, there they are in an urban environment, and nobody has any training in this. And the remarkable thing is, and this is why you really have to read the book, is how the infantry and the tanks worked out a system that you see happen time and again, where the infantry protects the tank, the infantry identifies targets for the tank. If the target is, say, a tank, the tankers get out of their tank, go with the infantry, they eyeball the target, they eyeball the terrain, the tactical situation, they know exactly what they're going to have to do to get rid of that tank that's threatening the infantry, and then they do it. I mean, it's kind of a beautiful thing to see this work out when you have partners that have grown to trust each other and talk to each other and communicate with each other. Next slide, please. And that is I think, knocked out tank in Casino. And if you look, I hope you can see that there are steel plates that are welded in front of the hatches on that tank. And that was a field fix to the shell trap. They added extra armor so and it's slightly angled so that if an AP round hit that shot trap, it was far less likely to penetrate the tank. Next slide, please. Anzio. Well, we talked a lot about Anzio last time in the big German armored attacks and what the tank destroyers did. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the tanks, but let's talk about them a little bit. Next slide, please. Hey, there's a tank at Anzio. Next slide, please. So this Operation Shingle, was supposed to land, move up into the mountains, cut off the communications line between Rome and the Gustav line, and force the Germans out. But as we all know, General Lucas didn't think he had a strong enough starting force to push up into the hills, so he hunkered down and subjected himself to siege warfare. While Kesselring had contingency plans in place, he knew there'd be a landing somewhere, and there were units all over Europe, from France to the Balkans, with pre-existing orders to get on a train and get moving to wherever the landing was. So by the time Lucas was ready to move, there was a ring of steel around Anzio. The good news, before the Anzio landings, the infantry divisions involved took the time to hunker down and do some real tank infantry training with their battalions. Again, this is January 1944, and at least in this theater of operations, we'll see it was a little better in the Pacific by this time. But it's only now that divisions are actually training with their tank battalions before they go into battle. And more good news was that tanks were with the initial wave, There was no delay like in the previous landings. And the best news of all was the Germans didn't defend the beach. But then again, you had the Ring of Steel. So by Italy, I think I mentioned earlier, the tank battalions had adopted the M7 as their assault gun. And this was a case where the battalion used its assault guns to destroy 6 Tigers that were caught in mud. And the plain old vanilla mediums knocked out 9 Panzers. And this is interesting for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it turned out that assault guns would repeatedly prove able to knock out heavy German tanks. The problem was that the shell had an erratic flight path, so you couldn't fire and hit a target at much more than 500 yards. Plus, there weren't that many assault guns around. The second interesting thing is this is the first time that the M4 series is up against Panthers. They'd faced Tigers in the past, but against Panthers. And so you have a supposedly superior German tank against an inferior American medium tank. And this was the first set of engagements that I think demonstrate that while the quality of tanks matters, the quality of the gun penetrating power matters, the quality of the armor matters, it matters as much what is the tactical situation. If the enemy is approaching you, and especially in this case, if he's road bound, you can place your inferior tank in a position to knock out a better tank. So let's go to the Germans almost reached the beach again. This time it wasn't artillery over open sights that stopped them. Next slide, please. This is a tank firing as artillery. Just an interesting observation. They have sandbags up on the back deck, and that was to minimize the chance that a mortar round would hit the deck and knock the engine out. Next slide, please. So the theater, I guess, finally gets it at this point. We saw tank infantry training before the operation. Frequent reattachments were a real problem. The 756 was subordinated to 3 different commands within 12 hours, and at least somebody tried to fix that. The 3rd Infantry Division commander and his deputy told a War Department observer that you had to keep the tank battalions permanently attached to the infantry divisions. This constant reattachment just wasn't going to work if you want to have a functioning combat partnership. The deputy theater commander, Jake Devers, told the same observer the same thing, and that he was ordering, and that all the infantry division commanders agreed with it, and he was ordering that tank battalions be permanently attached to the divisions in his theater. Now that didn't really hold up as it happened. Maybe it held up at Anzio, but on the race to Rome, you're going to see people being reattached all the time again. The observer recommended that tanks, at least command tanks, receive the infantry radio, so they can talk directly to the infantry company commander, who's maybe 150 yards away. And that goes up the chain of command, and it may be the reason that in the European theater, they start looking at installing these radios in the not-too-distant future. But none of these realizations affected the preparation for Overlord. It's terrible. They had all this combat knowledge from Italy, and the only thing I've ever seen is that Army Ground Forces sent separate battalion commanders in July, after it was way too late, a letter from a battalion commander, a tank battalion commander in Italy, saying, here are the lessons that we've learned. So, just... Anyway, next slide, please. The race to Rome again, this will be pretty fast. The cracking of the Gustav line actually started in the French sector. And interestingly enough, the 2nd Armored Group was supporting the French with 4 tank battalions, 1 battalion attached to each French infantry division. And the Americans had trained and equipped the French to look more or less exactly like American units. In fact, like the 2nd French Armored Division in Europe was able to play on an even field with American armored divisions. It fit right into the command system and everything else. But the French, they had their Gallic creativity. And they, for example, would intermix tank destroyers with the tanks. This was an idea that never caught on with the Americans until very late in the war in Italy, when the Americans started doing this. They also put French translators in command tanks with an infantry radio, so that the command tanks could actually talk to the infantry. So an idea that was only bubbling inside the U.S. Army, the French were actually implementing. And it's the first time that we saw American tanks communicating by radio with Cub artillery observation planes to spot panzers on the road ahead. And this actually became a fairly common practice in the European theater late in 1944. The Anzio breakout started on the 23rd of May. And interestingly, sticking with the radio theme, the 751st Tank Battalion tried using SCR 300 radios, and I'm not sure why, but it just didn't work. So it was unfortunate. The first sort of sizable attempt to do this didn't pan out. They lost 8 tanks and a tank dozer, and both battalions were using tank dozers, and this was the first combat use that I saw of a separate tank battalion using tank dozers, which became, again, very important in Normandy. So getting back to this National Guard battalion series, each one of them had a terrible combat experience. 2 of them were wiped out. The 191st Tank Battalion had the heaviest loss of the breakout from Anzio. By the 5th of June, over half of their officers had been killed or wounded, a lot of them by headshots from snipers, plus 75 men. And the casualties were so heavy, I actually mentioned this in the tank destroyer session, that this is why the infantry said they had to start using tank destroyers as tanks, because the 191st had suffered such heavy casualties. Next slide, please. So on the race to Rome, it was the first widespread use of the tactic of putting infantry on the decks of tanks. They had actually conducted some experiments with it in the Anzio bridgehead, minor tactical operations, and had worked out quite well. I know the Soviets did this all the time, but we were slow learners, I guess, with this. And, really in Italy, this was the first brief period tanks had to really run. So they thought of it and they did it. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to focus briefly on a 1st Armored Division task force commanded by Colonel Howes. The 1st Armored Division, when it started the breakout, just pretty much bogged down against German resistance. So they sent this task force sort of around the right to get past the defenses and start moving on Rome. And the 756th Tank Battalion had just arrived from the Gustav Line front, and for a day was attached to the 1st Armored Division. So this was our previous reference. This is the only occasion I'm aware of where a separate battalion was attached to an armored division, like could happen in theory. Now, it turned out that the infantry kept moving the battalion around, but by the time they actually got to Rome, it was back under Howes's command. The Germans had pulled out. They left a few tanks in Rome. There were a few scraps, but basically the entry was uncontested, and 3 separate battalions all all reached the Tiber River in Rome on the 5th of June, and they were the 191st, the 760th, and 191st. So, next slide. That's the end of Italy.
Okay, we are starting to run. I think we're going to be running a little bit long, so we're going to have to sort of do a slightly lighter version for Pacific and Europe, I think, because it's already gone 7:30. A couple of comments from the field. If you're Commonwealth, Household 6 is also known as Domestic Sunray. Defaulter Rort, a wild card. Were M8 Scots used with the infantry at all, or were they just light tanks like the Stuart? Now, they were assault guns, the M8 howitzer motor carriage.
Correct.
In addition to the assault, were they used anywhere else? Cavalry units had them, I think.
That's right. Yep. Mechanized cavalry had them.
Was the 8.8 Raketen Werfer 43 used in Sicily and Italy? Were they ever used effectively against U.S. armor?
I'm sorry, the which?
The 8.8 Raketen Werfer Dreien 14.
I don't know.
40. I don't know either off the top of my head. I would need to look.
I mean, that's a German bazooka.
Yeah. Italy saw you're talking about use of tanks like APCs, but the idea seems to stop with US soldiers after Italy. So do they do it in Europe and Pacific? If not, why not?
They certainly did in Europe, and they did it during the breakout phases. The first one in the race across France, and the second one after the Allies crossed the Rhine and were running through Germany.
Okay, well let's move on then to the Pacific.
Okay. So there's a map of the Pacific. Let's just move
Lots
on.
of islands.
Because we have to hurry. Lots of islands. That's right. Lots of islands. Next slide, please. Yes. So island wars. There are two command areas in the Pacific War: Southwest Pacific Command, commanded by General MacArthur, and the Pacific Ocean area commanded by Nimitz. And MacArthur wasn't really interested in tanks at the first. Nimitz, though, wanted to use armor in his operations. And the fourth of the National Guard battalions had been a medium tank battalion. It was supposed to go to the Philippines, but diverted to Oahu. And for the assault on Macon, it reorganized as a hybrid with no official doctrine or table of organization equipment. Company A had M3 medium tanks, Company C had M3A1 light tanks, and Company B received 49 of the LVT-1 Alligators. Next slide, please. The Army landed at Macon while the Marines landed at Tarawa. Again, the Marines suffered heavy losses in part because of these particular vehicles, but that did not happen to the Army. Next slide, please. So, let's do this in brief. What happened on this island was that it was the first case where it was demonstrated that LVTs could, well, this was being demonstrated at Tarawa too, but LVTs could cross coral and reach the beach, whereas landing craft had to dump their infantry far off from the beach and they had to slog their way through water to get to shore. The light tanks and medium tanks landed on separate beaches. Next slide, please. There's one of the LVTs from Macon. These are the M3 medium tanks. Next slide, please. The only lesson to be drawn from that island, it was a pretty small operation, is that it was great to have tanks on the beach with the assault force because the Japanese had lots of pillboxes and so on. And even though communication wasn't very good, the infantry was able to show the medium tank crews what needed to be knocked out, and they did it. It's not clear to me what the light tanks did, but anyway.
Surprising. So looking at the Macon battle, such as it is, the opposition was basically a reinforced, but it was commanded by a lieutenant.
Yeah,
and
it was not. It was not big, but they fought regiments? For 4 days.
Yeah, they held 2 regiments back. Just a lieutenant said, "That's some pretty nasty fighting. If a small unit like that could do that." Yeah.
Well, it took time. I guess this was the first time they had to peel people out of bunkers. So I'm sure there was a real learning curve with that. I don't know. So Bougainville is a good example for 2 things. And again, I'll kind of skip over this very quickly. The 3rd Marine Division landed there in October, and the 37th Infantry Division came in November. And the first tanks didn't arrive until January, the 754th Tank Battalion, and the Americal Division a week later. The Americal Division had trained thoroughly with the tankers before they came. It turned out that most of the tank work was with the 34th Division, but that was okay because the Tank Battalion was subordinated to the Corps. And I have no idea whether that suggestion in far-off Italy somehow got there or not. But that was the decision made. And several important things happened. First off, they experimented with mounting EE-8 field phones on a cable dragged by a tank, which they later simplified by simply mounting on the tank. So the infantry could actually talk to the tank on the battlefield constantly. They trained together with integrated combined armed teams, and everybody learned that the infantry was going to protect the tank when it went forward and reversed, and the tank was to support the infantry by fire. They would use machine guns and canister to clear vegetation so the infantry could see the bunkers. They would use armor-piercing shells to punch holes so the infantry could flame or put in explosions. They decided that they would move in short bounds so they didn't disorganize themselves, and take breaks so that everybody was in gear with one another. And speaking of gears, the tanks had to operate in first gear constantly, which was very hard on the right whirlwind. So a tank could do this for about 3 hours. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over the actual use of these tanks. Basically, the first few times they tried these tactics, they screwed it up. But eventually they got it right, and it started working perfectly. Next slide. One of the screw-ups happened because the Japanese, surely by luck, shot up all the field telephones, and that's when they mounted them on the tanks so that wouldn't happen again. So this is a diagram of the perfection of jungle tactics that they worked out. So you have 3 medium tanks in the 4 with 2 light tanks on the flanks. And the light tanks are protecting against infantry close assault because they have canister and machine guns. And behind the tank, you have an orderly who's on the telephone. Then you have targeteers who are going to mark the target with a smoke grenade so that the tank can blow it up. And then you have an array of other individuals in this configuration. You have riflemen and BAR men, and you have an engineer with explosives and so on. An integrated package talking to each other all the way through. Next slide, please. And this is a photo taken, I'm sure, of an exercise, but you can see that group bunched up behind the tank. And I assume that the 2 people up at the hull are one the guy on the telephone and the other's one of the targeteers. Next slide, please. Quadraline was the first big amphibian tank operation. And it was the 708th Battalion was not fully equipped, so they had to form a provisional unit with a lot of Amtracs. Next slide, please. Quadraline is in the right bottom. Next slide, please. This operation was set up so that the amphibian tanks would conduct the actual assault with the infantry, and once they worked off the beach, land tanks would follow. They would relieve the amphibian tanks, and then they would fight with the infantry in the interior of the island. And the tankers and infantry had trained together. They understood each other. They installed field telephones, and they installed flamethrowers in some of the light tanks. And for this operation, the battalion decided to swap their M7s for M10TDs, which I guess had a better, higher velocity round to use on bunkers. The one problem was that they decided to install TS7 phones on most of the tanks, which I think is a Navy unit. They had a few of the EE8s. Next slide. So here's one of the LVTs. Next slide. Here's one of the land tanks. I couldn't find any photos of the amphibian tanks from Quadraline. But if you look at that tank, on the left fender at the back is the field telephone. Next slide. The problem was this was, so the operation unfolded. The AM tanks did their thing. They cleared the enemy. The Japanese responded with close assault tactics to try to take the tanks out. The AM tanks scarf gunners were able to beat them all off, but a lesson learned was they didn't have enough armor, and they were going to work. They were going to fix that in the future. The land tanks landed, and the field telephones didn't work. So the experiment was a good idea, but it didn't really pan out. It took hours for them to get sorted. Next slide. Saipan was the bookend to Normandy. It was a large operation, and for the armored force, it was the largest amphibious operation they ever conducted. There were 268 armored force AMTANKs and AMTRACs at Saipan versus fewer than 200 at Normandy of DDs and wader tanks. Let's see how we can compress this. So the LVTs by now included the LVTA-4. The 708th Tank Battalion had the complement of tanks it was supposed to have. And this was an operation where the Army amphibians were supporting the Marine Corps. The 708th was attached to the 4th Marine Division. A Marine battalion was attached to the 2nd. And LVTs carried about half of the Marine infantry in, Army LVTs. Now, these were not just infantry and armor, they were infantry and armor from two completely different branches. And the Amtracs, actually all the amphibians had practiced the landing part with the Marines, but they had conducted absolutely no what after that training with the Marines. So they were going to be on the beach with no idea of how to communicate with each other. It was going to be sort of back to square one for that. So next slide, please. This is just a map of the landing beaches. I'm going to mention an airfield, which is on that map, but that's okay. Carry on. Next slide, please. So this, the bombardment was the heaviest yet in the Pacific. And I just like to imagine what it was like being in one of these amphibian tanks, because they are closing in on a barrage that's still falling at 300 yards. The Japanese, meanwhile, start directing well-aimed artillery at them at 600 yards. So they're coming in hot, and they can't see a damn thing when they hit the beach. But they had planned for this. And so they advanced in bounds. The Marines were supposed to be advancing with them. And there were being lessons learned on the other side of the hill. The Japanese had figured out that the Americans were going to put tanks on the beach, and Saipan was littered with tank obstacles on the beach. So the 708th lost a considerable number of tanks temporarily that got caught in tank traps. And only a few of the tanks made it all the way to the initial objective, which was the 01 line. During the assault, the AM tanks lost 8 destroyed, 6 damaged, and 7 for other reasons, probably swamping, plus 12 KIA and 83 wounded. The Amtraks collectively lost 8 knocked out completely, destroyed completely, 42 damaged, and 27 sunk. And when you compare this to Normandy, that's pretty close. So the Japanese were putting up just as much resistance to armored attack on their beaches as the Germans were going to. And the pattern of tank losses in the Pacific through the war was the same, that the Japanese, despite not having advanced tanks and 88 millimeter super weapons, they were claiming just about the same rate of attrition from the armored force as the Germans were able to. Next slide, please. So the picture in the upper left, there's an LVT-A4 on the right, an LVT in the center, and an LVT-A1 on the left, and they're fighting with the Marines on Saipan. And the second picture is an Army Amtrak carrying Marines to the 01 phase line, which is that wooded hill. Next slide, please. So to summarize what happens over the next few days, the Japanese fleet approaches, and the U.S. Navy decides it's going to evacuate the transports while they deal with this problem. And the idea at Saipan was more or less the same as at Kwajalein. You were supposed to land tanks, and they were going to take over, and then the AM tanks would do whatever, refit, refuel, whatever. But most of the land tanks got hauled off with the transports. The Marines had a few ashore. But what this meant was the infantry, again, had to have tanks. So the AM tanks were committed as land tanks for days of close combat on Saipan. And after a few days of this, their casualty rate was over 50%. The only land tanks on shore were 4 light tanks, Army. Next slide, please. Once the land tanks landed, we're going to talk very briefly about the battle in the interior, which is around that mountain peak, and they called that Death Valley. Next slide, please. So there were actually 2 tank battalions that landed.
Do you want to take a quick break and get a drink of water? Your voice is starting to go, I think.
Yeah, it is. 767. Okay, well, let's just roll on. The specifics aren't that important. What is important? Next slide, please. Next slide. The battle in the interior illustrated what I said. All that slide stacked up to was that the tank battalions committed there suffered very heavy losses to Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery. Coming out of this, the 708th made some recommendations, which were, one, that after the assault, their LVT-A4s fire as artillery, which was accepted by Corps and Army, and AMTank battalions would do that in the future. And they recommended that AMTanks never be used as land tanks again. And that didn't happen. Next slide, please. So, European theater.
Let's quick break there, so you can stop talking for a quick second as well. Ed, how often were the DD drive tanks used in the Pacific? I have a few photos, but this seems they were rare. And I guess a similar question for the Ritchie devices, the like the T9 swimming device with like a pontoon at the front and the back of the tank.
So to my knowledge, the DD tank was never used in the Pacific theater. The pontoons were used at Okinawa. That's the only time I think they were used.
Did any of the Army units in the Pacific get A2 diesel tanks?
Well, the Marines only used A2 diesel tanks.
Yeah, I thought so. It was just all that was available. So Ken is very adamant that it's nothing to do with fuel compatibility. It was just what was off the factory and available. 442nd dude at the front. What do we know about the 442nd RCT and the 36 Texas Division with their relationship with the independent tank battalions attached? Do you have any idea what tank battalion was attached to the 36th Texas and the 442nd RCT, the Nisei?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, you'll find a list of all the attachments there. So I have an idea, but I can't.
What's the website?
Yeide.net.
There you go, Yeide.net.
Yep.
Scrolling down. In the diagram of jungle warfare, the target designator will designate a target with smoke grenades for the tanks to shoot at. Can I assume that the grenade will be a rifle grenade and not something thrown by hand?
I believe it was thrown by hand. Actually, both were used. Specifically, I saw this. Both were used. And they learned they had to take half the charge out before using the grenade, because otherwise there was simply too much smoke.
Okay, that's it. So let's get on to Europe, and we'll finish. Hopefully, your voice will get to the end.
Okay, let's do it. Next slide, please.
Tragic's not going to be too annoyed because we're now at 2 hours.
Uh-oh. All right. Well, you want to come back and do it another time?
I've got nothing better to do.
Running. I'm ready.
Okay, Tragic says she's doing all right, so keep on going.
Okay. So Normandy, what didn't happen? What didn't happen is that while the Allies organized this phenomenally complex invasion and pulled it off, they did not train the tanks and the infantry beforehand. They did not prepare either party to deal with the bocage, even though they were well aware that the bocage, that is the hedgerow country, was where their troops were going to be fighting. They did not establish any way for the two parties to communicate with each other. Again, this had all been worked out already in Italy and the Pacific, and they were going to have to start from scratch in Normandy. It just kind of breaks the heart. And one of the ironies is that planners picked Normandy because the hedgerows would prevent a major German armored counterattack. But what about our attack, right? Next slide, please. So DDs, duplex drive tanks. This was a British invention, and it turned a Sherman into a floating boat, basically, that could move at 7 to 8 miles per hour in the water and deal with 3 foot of swell. Two companies, each from the 70th, 741st, and 743rd Tank Battalions, were issued the TDs and were part of the assault wave. In fact, they were to land on the beach before the infantry even got there. The third medium tank company would arrive in landing craft, and Company D, the light tanks, were left in the UK to join up later. Next slide, please.
I think, Ed, possibly to answer your DD question in the Pacific, there was investigation into DD tanks after the war. So there's actually in the collection in Anniston Army Depot right now, there is a 76mm HVSS DD tank that they were playing around with, complete with side skirts. So I don't know if it's possible that the photo that you saw might have been a post-war experiment in the Pacific. Sorry, just detouring off from that one.
Okay. So this is, Utah, where the 4th Infantry Division landed, was relatively smooth. The resistance there was light. Infantry moved into the interior very quickly. The 70th Tank Battalion, they decided to launch closer to shore, 1,500 yards instead of 5,000. 5 of their tanks sank anyway. And oddly, the Company C and the landing craft got to the beach before the DD tanks did. But that was a pretty good story. Omaha Beach was a mess. And again, read the book because it has lots of first-person accounts from people who were actually in the DD tanks and lived through all this. Next slide, please. So we talked about the 70th. The 743rd was attached to the 116th Infantry, which had the roughest landing. It ran right into the teeth of the defenses. And the sea was high enough that the battalion command decided that they were going to ask the LCTs to take them almost all the way to the beach, which is what happened. So essentially that entire battalion made it onto the beach and slugged it out with the defenders. They lost 16 tanks on the beach, and the Army history says, it's sort of hard to tease out exactly what their contribution was. But the 2nd Battalion commander of the 116th said, the DDs saved the day. They showed up when they needed. They shot the hell out of the Germans, and they got the hell shot out of them. And the history says what you do see is in account after account along the beach, all of a sudden there's a DD tank there, and it makes a difference. Next slide, please. The 741st had a disaster. The battalion commands, I've found the records, they made the call to launch at 5,000 yards. And all but 5 tanks from companies B and C sank. And 3 of the tanks would have sunk, except the first one off the ramp sank immediately. And the coxswain agreed to take the LCT all the way into the beach. So that means that only 2 tanks made it all the way to shore. And there's a sunk tank in this picture. Next slide, Pete.
I think those were also the 2 tanks that had commanders that knew how to operate a boat from civilian life.
Oh,
I don't remember that was in your book or somebody else, but it said these are 2 people that actually owned boats, and they both made it to the sea. Shore.
That's pretty good. So this is a picture that I found in actually Coast Guard records of 70th Tank Battalion DDs on the beach at Utah. Next slide, please. So the bocage, I'm not going to read this whole thing. Basically, Wayne Robinson tells you that it was hell. The hedgerows were individual battlefields, sometimes just a couple feet across, and the Germans defended every single hedgerow. And so the tank infantry team had to figure out a way to fight their way through this. Next slide, please. This is a train study that was done for one of the tank battalions, and all those thin lines that you see, those are the borders of hedgerows. I mean, it's just nuts thinking about trying to fight your way through hundreds of these things to make any ground at all. Next slide, please.
and then reporting on the radio what grid you're at when one hedge looks just like another hedge.
Well, and in fact, that was one of the things they had to work out, and one of the reasons that they started making those maps, because they would designate the individual hedgerow squares. So they could call in, where whatever the heck, 10K or something, and people would know exactly where they were. So the challenges that they confronted was, how do you communicate? Again, mouth to ear was terribly dangerous. Roads were death traps for tanks because the Germans always had an anti-tank gun sighted on it, and the infantry had to attack across the field. So, Steve Zalaga's favorite vehicle, the tank dozer. I mean, immediately, Tanker said, "Hey, we've got tank dozers," and they realized that you could punch through about 50% of hedgerows with a tank dozer. The problem was that the Germans were smart enough, of course, to figure out that if a tank dozer crashed through a hedgerow, it meant the tanks were going to come. It's going to back out, which gives you time. And then there are going to be tanks coming through the hole. So they would sight anti-tank guns on the hole created by the tank dozer. Next slide, please. There's a tank dozer. I mean, you're going to notice this thing, right? Next slide, please. So as far as I can tell, the 116th Infantry really started the creative buzz on how you deal with hedgerows. And they decided that by the 8th of June, I mean, this is pretty fast, they decided that what they would do is have the tanks fire across the hedgerow they were at the next hedgerow, especially at the corners, because the Germans tended to put machine guns or anti-tank guns there. And the infantry would advance under the fire. Then the engineers would blow a hole. And presumably the enemy on the far side of the field had been largely depressed. And the infantry would screen for, they always talked about bazookas. I mean, the main threat was the Panzerfaust. And the Panzerfaust could punch through the front armor of a Sherman. And this approach became widespread. Next slide, please. So here's a pictorial depiction of what I just said. And, it was circulated to folks. Next slide, please. Familiarity. Again, knowing each other made a huge difference. And they had some terrible experiences. Tanks would be separated from the infantry and fall prey to Panzerfaust. There were a fair number of incidents where tanks fired on friendly infantry. And they had to work this out. Now, another model here was the 1st Infantry Division, and of course they'd worked with tanks on Sicily. They also had the 745th Tank Battalion that was going to stay attached to the division through the entire war. And that was a privileged position. They attached one company to each regiment and one platoon to each battalion. So again, the battalion is scattered across the division. They consolidated all 6 assault guns into a 6-gun battery that could tie into artillery. They distributed the headquarters section tanks to the companies and kept the light tanks as a compact unit. And part of the genius was that they had the tankers and the infantry eat together. The men got to know each other as individuals. They got to trust each other as individuals. Now, there were other tank battalions that had this kind of relationship with their infantry division, but there were more than a few that got transferred from division to division. And anytime you saw that happening, you knew that they were starting from scratch, that they didn't have this kind of relationship with the infantry. And they had the wisdom to pause operations in 7th and 19th Corps in late June to early July to share lessons learned and train the troops in hedgerow fighting. Next slide, please. Communications. About 20 June, they started installing the EE-8 field phones in tanks. And again, I don't know whether this was word that arrived saying, hey, you know, they've been doing this in the Pacific and it works well, but it started happening. And it became standard in most battalions, but you can't tell why some battalions waited weeks or months to have this basic communication system installed. On the 18th, one of the tank groups ordered that every battalion send a Jeep with a tank radio to the battalion headquarters and infantry platoons. So now they're actually getting a tank radio pretty far down the tactical chain. And it was not till the autumn, around October, that they started installing the tank version of the infantry SCR 300 in tanks, the ANVRC-3. The official history claims this started in Normandy, but in no separate tank battalion records have I found that. Next slide, please. And experience. As I mentioned briefly before, tank battalions tended to lose a large share of their tanks in the first few weeks of combat. And after that, they learned what not to do. They learned to work better with the infantry. Next slide, please. There were field solutions for things like Panzerfausts and getting through hedgerows. I'll just mention two quickly. One was that they started sandbagging tanks. And there's a dispute over whether or not this actually worked. But a field test showed that putting sandbags reduced the chance of a Panzerfaust penetration. So the 743rd Tank Battalion sandbagged all of them, and a lot of battalions did sandbagging. The second was the Cullen Hedgerow device, which was held as a secret until Operation Cobra, the breakout, which allowed a tank to bowl through a hedgerow. And, you know, we had some discussion about whether these things work. There is one case study where the 71st Tank Battalion arrayed all of its Rhino tanks, as they were called, and launched an attack on the 26th of July on the German defenses. And they ripped through the hedgerows under a timed airburst artillery barrage that kept the Germans down and blew everything up with guns and tracks, rolled over the Germans, advanced 500 yards, came back, did it again on the way back, but probably not using their main guns. And then they advanced with the infantry and found hundreds of KIA. So there was at least one case where the hedgerow device was used profitably. Next slide, please. So here's a twofer picture. So you have sandbags and a Cullen hedgerow device. Next slide, please. After Cobra, the Allies advanced across France with great speed. You know, you can read the book. This is when infantry was riding on tanks again. And new equipment started reaching the separate tank battalions. Encounters with the Panther in Normandy had alarmed everybody because the 75 couldn't penetrate its front armor. And even the 3-inch gun on the tank destroyers had to be very, very close to get a penetration. So the ETO, which had resisted introducing 76 millimeter armed Shermans, which were available, suddenly said, "Yeah, we want these things," and they started arriving during August after Cobra launched. Problem was that, again, you couldn't really count on it penetrating even a Panther except at close range. Late in the fall, they started getting high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that could kill from 300 feet, but most of that went to the tank destroyers, and only a trickle reached the tank battalions. And secondly, they started to receive flamethrowers to install in the bow gunner seats of tanks. And this was foresightful. It was intended to be used against bunkers. But they hadn't really thought it through because the range of the flamethrower was about the same as the range of a Panzerfaust. And tank crews wound up hating these things because if you tried to use one, odds were you were going to get knocked out by a Panzerfaust. They also got rockets. They weren't used widely. I'm not going to talk about them. Next slide, please. So here this is the landing in southern France at Saint-Tropez. DD tanks, next slide, please, were used by the 3 battalions that landed there. They only had one company of them each. There was minimal resistance in the south. Not that there was none, but the Germans realized that with the Normandy force advancing across their rear, they had to get the heck out of Dodge. So the entire Army Group G started withdrawing towards Alsace. And the campaign in the south was largely a pursuit. Next slide, please. The one interesting thing from a TD perspective, next slide, please, was that the 756th Tank Battalion formed part of an ad hoc combat command called Butler Task Force, which raced up parallel to the German withdrawal and tried to cut them off at a town called Montélimar, which was the only biggish battle that occurred. But you should look at the book if you want to hear more about that. So here are some pictures of the 76 millimeter Shermans that were reaching the troops. The top one left is an M4A1 with the gun. That's an armored division tank, actually. The right is the M4A3 with the 76, and the bottom picture is the E4 or 5 flamethrower. That, by the way, was popular in the Pacific because the Japanese didn't have Panzerfaust. So the Siegfried line was another challenge, but the good news was that the divisions that had fought in Normandy knew that they had to form effective infantry engineer tank, and here they started introducing the tank destroyer a bit into the teams, combined with artillery and even air support to go after the fortifications along the west wall. There was no doctrine, no training for it. They had to work it all out, but they did work it out sort of in the way they had in Normandy. It was also the first big urban fight at Aachen, and that's what I'm going to look at very briefly. Next slide, please.
Since you mentioned it, Cynicomatic wants to know if did the tankers ever put an air controller, a forward air controller, in one of the early tanks, or was that?
That was an armored division thing. The armored divisions had forward controllers with them. They were better integrated. Well, the separate battalions weren't integrated with tactical air at all. Their integration at about this time started to emerge with the artillery observation planes. An armored division tank commander could summon up air support, but a separate tank battalion commander couldn't.
Yeah, it seems to me if you're supporting the infantry as an attachment, a divisional attachment, it's the infantry are probably going to be calling in the airstrikes. Yeah,
if that happens at all. So Aachen, in a nutshell, in October, 7th and 19th Corps did a classic double envelopment and surrounded the city. And the 26th Infantry Regiment was assigned to capture the city. Again, nobody had trained for this stuff. The 2nd Battalion had to take the city center. So just looking at them, there's a typo on this slide. It was Lieutenant Colonel Daniels was the battalion commander. And he was a creative guy. What he did was he assigned 1 or 2 tanks or tank destroyers to every one of his platoons. And the armor would fire. This was a building by building clear. They learned they had to clear every single building, and they had to shut up the sewer lines as they went, because the Germans would re-infiltrate behind them through the sewers and attack them from the rear. So building by building, they moved. The armor would fire on the building, usually using HE fuse delayed, so it would explode inside, And once the infantry thought everything looked good, the tanks would cease fire entirely. The infantry would take the building, and then it would start over again. And the infantry would advance first to protect the tanks. They'd advance 100 yards and take out anybody with a Panzerfaust, spot anti-tank guns if they could. And as the tanks advanced, there were 4 riflemen assigned to each tank to prevent close assault. Once they reached a corner, the tanks would fire on all 4 at an intersection. They'd fire on all 4 corners because they presented the best places for fields of fire. And there were checkpoints arrayed along the battalion's line to make sure that everybody was moving at exactly the same pace as they went through the city. Meanwhile, artillery was falling 4 blocks ahead, steadily creeping forward as the infantry advanced. So out of just creativity on the battlefield, an urban doctrine emerged that was later captured in field manuals. Next slide, please. And this is a picture, it's a TD, but this is street fighting in Aachen. Next slide, please. The Chieftain mentioned the Jumbo earlier. The tank on the left is a Jumbo. The Army produced 250 some of these for use on the west wall. The tank had about 6 inches of armor on the glacis and 13 inches on the turret front. And in October, 2 battalions converted to mine-clearing battalions using the crab tanks that the British had developed. The book has some incidents involving those, if you're interested. Next slide, please. The bulge. So I'm just going to look briefly at what was the largest tank battle that a separate tank battalion ever had. And it turned out to be strategically, at least operationally, a significant one. It was the fight at the twin villages, Rocherat and Krinkelt, which lay in the path of the 6th SS Panzer Army, which was the main effort when the offensive began on 16 December. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division was supposed to clear the path for the 12th SS Panzer Division. But the 99th Infantry Division, which was green, this was its first fight, put up a pretty tough resistance. And so 1st SS Panzer Corps ordered a reinforced battalion of SS Armor to move forward to help clear the path. Meanwhile, the 2nd Infantry Division ordered the 741st Tank Battalion, which had lost so many tanks at D-Day, to send Company B to Rocherat, which was the only escape route for the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. And by the 17th, the rest of the battalion was ordered to go there with less their light tank positions. And they arrayed in a semicircle around the approaches to Rocherat. Next slide, please. This is Rocherat. At the time, it was full of really stout stone buildings. I visited there some years ago, and I was kind of surprised. A lot of that stuff was just gone. But this is a nightmare. This is a nightmare to send armor into against an organized defense. That's Ambush City. And the Germans learned a bad lesson about urban warfare in this pathetic little village in the Ardennes. Next slide, please. So on the 17th, the SS hit the American lines for the first time. Charles MacDonald, who wrote some of the Green Books, the official histories, was involved in this actual exchange and has left a very interesting account about it. As he explains it, the M4s kept backing up because they didn't want to try to take on Panther tanks. They knew they'd get creamed, but it reached a point where they had no choice. They were simply going to have to give battle. as MacDonald explained it, and they both were destroyed. But they took out 3 Panthers that night. Jagdpanzer IVs with Panzer Grenadiers came into Krinkled and almost reached the tank battalion CP. And by now there are a bunch of buildings burning, but it was pretty dark, and tanks were engaging each other at 50 feet, 100 feet, and that fight went very badly. The Germans knocked out 3 tanks. But the next day, they came again, approached the battalion's command post, where the battalion had put 2 deadline tanks for anti-tank defense. It was foggy. There was, again, burning buildings, a lot of smoke in the air, and the German crews clearly didn't see these things sitting there, and the Panthers rode by, exposing their flanks, and these 2 non-running tanks knocked 5 of them out, and a runner took out the 6th. At the same time, can we go back to that map real quick? Can we go back a couple slides? Yeah. So if you can see on this map, every X on this map is a knocked out German tank. I mean, if you look, they're just, the X's are all over the place, and most of these cases, it's something like this, that the Germans find themselves in a situation where the defending inferior tanks can take them out. So next slide, please. They kept coming, and both sides were losing tanks. Next slide, please. That's a destroyed Panther in Rocherat. Next slide, please. So the last attack was on the 19th. And again, there's a great account in the book about the crews that dealt with it. The 2 tanks teams tried to encircle each other, basically. And the Germans had the worst end of it and drove into the sights of the M4s. So again, they found themselves in a position in superior tanks where the Shermans could knock them out. Anyway, they gave up after that, and the reconstruction credited the 741st Tank Battalion with 27 enemy tanks for the loss of 8 Shermans. And they had held the 1st Panzer Corps so long at these 2 little villages that the Germans had to shift the main effort in the Ardennes south to the 5th Panzer Army. Next slide, please. So in 1945, Germany collapsed. The tanks ran fast. That's the sum of it. There were some more urban battles that are kind of interesting to read about. More equipment showed up. The M24 light tank started to replace the M5 light tank. And in fact, the 740th Tank Battalion accidentally was the first to use 2 of them in battle, in the Battle of the Bulge. And the final version of the M4 series, the M4A3E8, showed up. That tank performed very well against the T-34 in Korea. So it was good. It had, again, a 76 millimeter gun and better suspension and broader tracks. Next slide, please. So there's the M24 compared to the M5 and an Easy 8 in the lower right. Next slide, please.
All right, let's take another quick pause as we're done with Europe. Kinder Server God. My question is, why are tanks taken out after 1 shot in the movies? Is it actually like that back then?
Not typically. I mean, you especially in American accounts, when they're firing on Panthers, you see them using a lot of ammunition. And what did the Chieftain report about ammunition usage by the tank destroyers at Anzio?
It's ridiculous amounts.
Yeah.
Well, part of it was also they once they penetrated and stopped it, they'd fire it with HE to set it alight, because you can repair a tank that hasn't burned. You can't repair a tank that has burned.
Yeah.
And the other thing is there's different rules in different armies as to when you can get out. So the German army rule was if the tank is not on fire, or at least as far as you know it's not on fire, you don't get out. Whereas the American rule is a little bit more flexible. It's like if it is in your best judgment to get out, then do so. So oftentimes, just because you survived the first penetration, you may feel a little bit disinclined to sit around and see if you survive the second penetration. Right. So they might get out, and then another 7.5 comes in and then burns up the tank. Video games tend not to have people get out of the tank as quickly. 741st, what tanks? I presume it was M4s.
Yes,
it's in the book.
M4A1s.
Okay, well, on to that. Last chance to enter in for the quiz for next month's book, Marines Under Armor by Ken Estes.
Ken's a great guy, by the way. You'll love him.
Yep. Well, I'm sure. Did you ever meet him ever before or since Think Tank?
Neither. I might have run into him one time after that. I think I ran into him at the National Archives. Yes, I did. Yeah.
I ran into Zaloga in the National Archives as well, just scanning away.
Yeah, I've run into him out there. Mark Reardon, who used to be at the Center for Military Historian, did a great book on the Mortain counteroffensive.
They got a whole book?
Yeah.
Well, usually it's like a half a chapter in most books.
Yeah, well, he got down into the weeds. So MacArthur said he would return, and he did. Landed at Yeide in October of 1944, and this operation was unusual because it involved both the Southwest Pacific area and the Pacific area. The Pacific area happened to have an invasion force handy because they'd planned to invade Yap, which had a major air base, but the Japanese had lost so many airplanes that air base no longer had a function. So instead of invading Yap, they went and helped invade Yeide. And the style of invasion was very different. The Southwest Pacific crowd landed 2 infantry divisions that shared the equivalent of a single tank battalion. And they used some LVTs, but most of the troops came ashore in landing craft. The Pacific area invasion was 2 divisions, each of which had an AMTank battalion and fully outfitted with Amtraks, and then the land tanks, and their divisions were allotted a full tank battalion each. Next slide, please. So there's a map of Yeide with the landing beaches on the east side. I'm just going to briefly mention some action there, very briefly, and then I think one slide on what happened over on the northwest corner as the Japanese defenses were driven into the hinterland. Next slide, please. Oh, hey, I only have a slide on that. Well, what I can say about the AMTanks during the landing is that they tied into the artillery, just like the new doctrine said, but the next day the ground was too marshy for land tanks, so the AMTanks had to go out again and fight as land tanks. And at Compton Hill, the only time an entire AMTank battalion fought in line occurred. So it's very important for historically obscure reasons. Okay, so AMTank cavalry. So the 7th Infantry Division is operating up in that northwest area, and there's this crazy cavalryman, Lieutenant Colonel Kane, who had commanded the 776th Tank Battalion, but he'd been moved to a land tank battalion. And he went to the 7th Division and he said, if you give me all of the LVDA4s with 75 millimeter howitzers, at sea, we could take on a couple destroyers if we had to. And I think that this would be a great idea if we take the tanks and some Amtraks with infantry, and we can do that end-around run and get behind the Japanese defenses. So they did. They organized a provisional amphibian unit, and on the 5th of December, they supported the 184th Infantry attack by looping around the Japanese lines, and they shelled the Japanese from sea. Turrets right. Then they ran ashore and shelled everything they could see, and then they left. And the infantry said, yeah, well, that unhinged the defenses. And they kept doing this kind of amphibian cavalry stuff with the 7th and 77th Infantry Divisions into February 1945. Next slide, please.
Did they have stabilizers in those? I know certainly when they were testing Ritchie devices for like the M18, they realized that they needed to fit a stabilizer for firing when afloat.
I do not know. Okay, Luzon. So Luzon, the action that we're going to talk about is essentially the same area as the first map. Between Lingayen Gulf and Manila, and then also very briefly the upper half of the island, which is the Japanese realized first that they couldn't hold the Philippines. The point of the Philippines was to kill as many Americans as possible for defense of the home islands. And to hold down resources as long as possible. So the Japanese commander decided not to defend the landing beaches with a strong force. They were defended, but his strategy was we withdraw into the hills and make the Americans come and dig us out. And a lot of those hills were up in the northern part of the island. There was a battle in Malta because the Navy said that's cowardice, and we're gonna fight to hold Malta, which is essentially why there was a big fight there. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, well, first off, the campaign in Luzon was as close to a European campaign as anything in the Pacific Theater. They had roads, they had infrastructure. There was actually a short breakout run of 100 miles. Nothing like that on any other island. The Japanese had a tank division on the island. So unlike anywhere else in the Pacific, the tankers encountered some other tanks. And the big difference was, as I mentioned earlier, the tank density to the infantry. They were working with a half or less of the amount of tank support that any division in Italy or Europe would expect. The 716th Infantry Battalion, for example, had trained with its companies had trained with 3 separate infantry divisions, and it landed divided between 2 infantry divisions, and it wound up being attached to 10 infantry divisions. So, all these problems with familiarity were going to rear their ugly head time and time again. So let's just take that as a given. The initial encounters with Japanese tanks near the Lingayen Gulf quickly convinced the Japanese that their tanks simply couldn't stand up to the Americans. And after that, the Americans only encountered Japanese tanks dug in as pillboxes. Next slide, please. The breakout, the race to Manila. They cleared the beach area quickly. 1 corps turned north, and the 14th Corps turned toward Manila. And this is a very prestige thing for MacArthur, and he he told the Corps to send a flying column to Manila, stat, to rescue the American internees who were being held there. So this was organized. The 1st Cavalry Division was in the Philippines fighting as an infantry division. And the 1st Cavalry Brigade organized this flying column, which included 2 companies of the I'm getting my tank, 44th Tank Battalion, of course, 44th Tank Battalion. So they made a 100-mile run to Manila. That was the big breakout event of the Pacific Theater. Securing the internees was easy. Medium tank, Battalion Basic. See, it's named after a woman. I think it's Battalion Basic.
I think it's a C.
Maybe it's a C. All right. Well, anyway, it knocked down the gate to the intern camp. But securing Manila is another problem entirely. Next slide, please. Here is a 44th Tank Battalion tank in Manila. That's entering the old town. And so you can see how tight things were there. Next slide, please. So the fight for Manila started with the CAV, and the 37th Infantry Division moved in to take the part of the city on the other side of the river. The cavalry had never worked with tanks, and initially it assigned tanks to missions, which sent them out without any infantry support. And lo and behold, these tanks suffered close assault attacks with mines, and their tanks blew up. So I guess the tankers complained about this, and you see pretty quickly under the pressure of events that the cavalry troops start to learn how you can work with a tank. You see the same thing where tanks are bombarding the concrete buildings where the Japanese are holed up. And this is where the flamethrower becomes popular, because the Japanese can't take out a tank with the E45 flamethrower, and it's extremely useful for clearing out buildings that the Japanese are holed up in. And the cavalry in the end said that the tanks were instrumental in securing Manila. The 37th Infantry Division didn't know what to do with its 754th Tank Battalion components, didn't use them at all until the 14th of February. And once they got some tanks up into the city and watched what they could do, they were like, wow, we got to get more tanks in. And they especially liked the assault guns, so they got as many assault guns as they could. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to move on now to the one sort of tank battle that occurred in the Pacific War. And to set the mood, we have a tank passing a knocked out Japanese medium. I have no idea where that picture was taken. Next slide, please. And I did an article on this for the Chieftain. It's somewhere on your website at World of Tanks. So this is the battle at Muñoz. And it wasn't a tank battle in the classic sense until its final moments. But the Japanese were dug into Muñoz with about 60 medium and light tanks. And they were dug in like pillboxes, but they could move. And the Japanese had arranged alternate firing positions, so every night the tanks would move somewhere else. And this was all tied into an extremely sophisticated defense with anti-tank guns, fairly large artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and every position had interlocking fire with multiple other positions. So it was a really hard nut to crack. And after 6 days of working on this, the tanks and infantry had managed to take half the town. Now, only a platoon of tanks was engaged in this, but they lost 2. So, you're looking at 40% tank losses by the time you get to this point. The Japanese finally decided they were going to lose it all. And so on the night of 7 February, the remaining tanks tried to break out. And they had the misfortune to run into other tanks from the battalion. They were driving at night, and the tankers heard them coming, and basically blind fired and had the good fortune to set a vehicle on fire, which allowed them to see the other tanks. And at the end of the day, they knocked out 11 Japanese tanks. So technically, that was the biggest tank battle of the war in the Pacific. Historical oddity. Next slide, please. There was a long, hard battle in the north. It went on all the way until the Japanese surrendered in August. And it's a strange use of tanks. I'm not going to really talk about it. Let it be said that individual tanks were often the main actors, and the infantry had to use bulldozers to clear a path through the jungle to get a single tank in a position to affect the tactical situation. There was no fire and movement. None of that stuff was going on up there. So, like I said, it dragged on until Japan surrendered. Next slide, please. Okinawa. Next slide, please. This is the very brief amphibian phase of the landing. There were, I think this is the 708th Amphibian Tank Battalion, and it's one of the few really cool pictures of amphibian tanks at sea that I can find. Anyway, next slide, please. So Okinawa proved to be a graveyard of tanks. And it was a big surprise to the U.S. Army here so late in the war. On April 1st, 2 Army and 2 Marine divisions went ashore. And the Japanese simply didn't defend the beaches here. They'd learned that if you defend the beach, the U.S. Navy is going to destroy everything that's there. So there's absolutely no point to doing it. So the Americans moved in. The Marines moved north to secure that half of the island, and the Army moved south. And it just so happened that the Japanese had concentrated essentially all of their defenses forces in the south of the island, which was one big rugged assortment of mountains with lime ridges riddled with caves. It was perfect defensive terrain, and they had close to 100,000 troops to defend it. The estimate was 66,000, but that was wrong. So the 2 infantry divisions, 96th, and we're going to have to wait till the next slide. I think it's the 77th was the other, wheeled south and very soon ran into the first Japanese defenses. And the Japanese were very good. They had figured out how to use their artillery in direct fire and extremely well controlled indirect fire. They, again, just like on Saipan, were masters of tank traps now, landmines, anti-tank guns. And, by 9th of April, only 43 of the 54 medium tanks of the 783 Tank Battalion were still in action. Next slide, please. Here are some tanks on Okinawa, and to the grognard, it's somewhat interesting that one of these tanks up in the back on top of the hill has the HVSS suspension, which came on the Easy 8. So it does indicate that the Pacific theater was receiving some fairly modern tanks by this point in time. Next slide, please. Oh, it was the 7th Infantry Division. Well, the 7th Division, they had a pretty rotten record when you look back on it all. They misused the 711th Tank Battalion, again, for reconnaissance up front. They kept sending tanks forward, and the Japanese had created these beautiful tank traps, canalized movement with close assault teams, anti-tank guns sighted, and they just kept knocking tanks out. And even after a few of these long-range incidents turned out badly, the infantry still insisted that the tanks advance 600 yards in front of the infantry. One battalion in October of 44 had converted to the Army's only flamethrower battalion, the 713th Tank Battalion Armored Flamethrower. These tanks had their main gun replaced with a big Mongo flamethrower that could throw flame 155 yards. It had only a crew of 4. And what they wound up doing was dispersing the companies of this battalion to 3 separate tank battalions. So each tank battalion had flame tanks to work with. The misery ended by heavy rains, and the offensive just had to stop for a while. Next slide, please. So you had a 1-for-1 infantry division tank battalion ratio here. It was the only time in the Pacific theater they reached a European level of tank support. But again, the terrain was a lot like Italy and Sicily, so the tanks had a lot of trouble working with the infantry. Next slide, please. We're going to look at just one incident because, in part, it involves the 4th of the National Guard tank battalions and its disaster, the 193rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 27th Infantry. And, you know, this should have gone well, because the division and the battalion, the division and the battalion had undergone actual tank infantry training. They knew how to work with each other. The tanks had infantry radios. They had phones if the radios failed. But the 105th Infantry came up with a plan that played right into the Japanese defenses. And the Japanese strategy by Okinawa was to deliberately try to separate the American tanks and infantry, because they'd realized that package was lethal. And if they could separate the tanks and infantry, they could deal with them separately. So the 105th wanted to take a town called Kakazu, which was on the far side of a ridge called the Kakazu Ridge. And they had engineers build a bypass. The tanks couldn't go over the ridge, but using the bypass, they could swing around the ridge and get into Kakazu that way. The infantry, meanwhile, was going to assault over the ridge and meet the tanks in the town. But the Japanese had anticipated precisely this attack. Next slide, please. I think that's a map. Yeah. So the Japanese had put infantry along the ridge with a lot of machine guns. They had specialized suicide attack squads ready to go after the infantry. It was a death trap. And on the bypass, they had set up anti-tank guns. They also had suicide teams there with mines to attack the tanks. A death trap of its own, and the village was absolutely chock-a-block with mines of every sort, scattered randomly. There was no rhyme or reason to it. Next slide, please. So the tank attack launched, and it was in 2 phases. The first was supposed to reach the town, and the second was to kick off when the infantry went up the hill. So out of that first wave, 2 tanks hit mines, 1 turned over, a 47 millimeter gun knocked out 2 flame and 3 M4s. And the remainder entered the village, burned and shelled it. But when the rest of the tanks arrived, they lost a bunch to mines. They lost 1 to a suicide squad. The infantry never got over the hill. The radio communications broke down, in part because the infantry battalion CP was wiped out, And finally, the tank battalion ops officer, the S2, convinced the regimental commander that they just had to pull the tanks out of Kakazu, but so many command tanks had been knocked out, they didn't know if everybody got the message. So he took his tank into the village where it was knocked out and abandoned. And when the day was over, the company had lost 22 tanks in a single engagement, which was the highest of any single engagement in the Pacific Theater. 2 days later, the battalion commander himself was killed by a 47 millimeter anti-tank gun. So this National Guard battalion was truly cursed too. And it just goes to show that Murphy's Law can take a system that was practiced and still screw it all up. Next slide, please. So just a couple pictures. The top picture is the E45 bow-mounted flamethrower, and the bottom picture is the main gun flamethrower. Next slide, please. Okinawa evolved into a cave war. The Japanese had put all of their defenses practically into caves because they could neither be bombed nor shelled into submission, which meant that somebody had to go in and peel them out. And they had everything from large artillery pieces to anti-tank guns to infantry machine gun nests, everything else in these caves. Again, interlocking fields for everything, support positions, and there was no doctrine for this. So the guys in the field had to work this out. So when they went back on the offensive, they developed what was known as cave warfare, which involved a small number of tanks working, often just one, working with infantry. And it sounds a lot like urban warfare. The tank would fire suppressing fire at the cave and deal with any fire coming back out. Well, I skipped this step. First, the infantry found the cave by getting shot at. That was the only way to find these things. And once that happened, they'd call in artillery and airstrikes on the cave. Wasn't going to hurt the Japanese, but it stripped away all the camouflage so you could see what you were dealing with. Then a tank started shooting at it while the infantry crept up with flamethrowers and charges to the cave. And another group of infantry provided overwatch. So when that supporting machine gun position opened up on the infantry, they would suppress that fire. Once the infantry got up, or if they had a flame tank, they didn't have to go through that step. They would flame the cave, which would either kill everybody in it or drive them out, and they would simply be gunned down. So it was a brutal and vicious form of warfare, but that's what they had to do. Next slide, please. Tank losses were dreadful. By the end of May, 57% of the tanks had been knocked out. That's 94, totally destroyed. And the Army hadn't planned for this kind of attrition. There was no tank reserve. So they had to strip one of the battalions, the 193rd, and turn their tanks over to the other three battalions to continue the fight. When they tried to have more tanks shipped in, they learned they wouldn't arrive until the campaign was almost over. So again, this wasn't Europe. The Japanese didn't have a sophisticated armored force, but they were exacting attrition that was as bad as anything in Europe. The tankers noticed that the Japanese resistance plummeted starting about mid-June. And for the first time in the entire Pacific War, large groups of Japanese soldiers started to surrender. The Japanese commander committed suicide on the 22nd of June, and all resistance ended on the 2nd of July. Next slide, please. You survived. Some of you probably were attrited, but some of you survived. And there we check out on a tank with a big muzzle blast. By the way, the tankers didn't like the 76 millimeter gun, in part because they complained that it had a huge muzzle blast. And I've wondered, why did that bother them so much when the tank destroyers had the 3-inch gun, which was essentially the same weapon, and it didn't bother them. And all I can think of is that the tank destroyer had an open turret, they had a good field of vision, and it was easier to figure out where their round was going. But the tankers, were looking through these little periscopes, and with too much muzzle blast, it's hard.
That's one possibility. The other one that I've seen is there is actually a difference between a blast deflector and a muzzle brake. So the muzzle brake is put in there to reduce the effective recoil on the gun, whereas a blast deflector is designed to move the gases in such a way that it reduces obscuration, especially coming off the ground and bringing up dust and dirt and so on.
Right.
And oftentimes the two are they are mutually exclusive. If you're going to have something to reduce the recoil, then you're going to have more obscuration created. So that's my question. Reading from that.
Yeah.
A couple of questions, last several questions, I guess. Were there any tanks that functioned better overall in the Pacific than in Africa or Europe? I don't know about better, but longer, perhaps. I mean, the M3 was well regarded, the medium.
Well, yeah, but it didn't really spend all that much time on the battlefield in the Pacific. So it's hard to say. Well, the M3 and the M4 were both
I think the British
reliable.
used it, though. Yeah.
And there were tanks that landed in Normandy that went all the way till the end in Europe. They made it 1,000 miles, and tracks wore out. That was a big problem. But you can replace a track, but the machines themselves held up well. I guess I would say that, this is apples to oranges. The tanks that functioned the best for what they needed to do in the Pacific, much of the time when the spear first hit the enemy, were the AM tanks.
I get that. There's a certain logic there. Why had they not planned for such losses? My guess is because of all the other previous engagements, there wasn't such attrition, so they didn't think there would be anything different.
Yeah, well, the attrition in the Philippines, it wasn't over 50%, but it was close to 50%. But there were only 2 separate tank battalions there, and I don't know, maybe the lesson just didn't register. Plus, the Philippines campaign was still going on when Okinawa started, so they didn't really have lessons learned from there, maybe.
Where can you read more about the 740th at the Bulge? That was a fascinating bit in the book.
There is, in fact, a separate book about that battalion. I can't remember who wrote it, but Amazon is your friend.
Why did the British tanks reload so much quicker? I don't know what that means. Did the Pacific get Pershings eventually?
No. Well,
yeah, not in time for the
battle. Not in battle. And the separate tank battalions never got Pershings.
I guess the last question then is, what happened after the war? What were they still independent tank battalions in Korea?
Yes, in fact. And I wanted to write a book about that, but my publisher had, nobody buys books about the Korean War. But yeah, in fact, I didn't, that stop loss sort of became famous in the modern military, that soldiers found that they could be kept in the service. Well, soldiers who left the service after World War II learned that they could be remobilized and sent to Korea. And so a lot of the tank battalion commanders from World War II that I was very familiar with, I went through the records of the tank battalions, and these guys got sent back to frickin' Korea to fight a battle that was more or less the same as the one they'd fought in World War II.
Did the Army consider the flame tanks a success on Okinawa?
Yes, definitely.
Would the separate tank battalions have played a large role in the invasion of Japan? I mean, I presume so.
Yes, they were planned to play a large role. And in fact, there were separate tank battalions from Europe that were preparing to move to the Pacific Theater, but locked out.
Was the truth in the rumor that the Pacific Theater got inferior equipment that was no longer up to scratch for the European theater of war?
Well, it wasn't that so much as they got what the Army had when they went to war, and it took a longer time for modern stuff to reach them. So, like the M3 light and medium are in service in 1943. In fact, probably there were still some M3 light tanks in service in 1944. But, they were all...
Being with the Commonwealth forces, the Australians or the British, they would have used them much, much longer.
Yeah.
Why aren't flame tanks used more in later wars? So I guess you don't hear much about in Korea. They certainly showed up in Vietnam, the M67.
Well, I guess it depends on what your exact problem is. And in Korea, their problem was the Chinese army overrunning them.
We need more ammunition, not more flame.
Yeah, and so your difficulty wasn't clearing them out of caves and stuff like that, or out of buildings.
Okay, let's go on then, and we'll call out the results of the prizes. So the winners of the Thunderbolt tank are Beef Dog 1230, Von Richthofen 555, triple nickel, and Bob 3030. The winners of the book, which again is Marines Under Armor by Ken Estes. So you never guess who we've got on next month. Bread Pirate, Lurcurious, and I Just Want T-Book. Whatever that is. I have no idea. But there we go. Those are the winners. Watch out for the prizing. It took a little while for the books to get out last time for the last prizing, but hopefully we'll do a bit better. Harry, your voice has finally made it to the end.
Yeah. Hey, I have one more thing to say.
Yeah, what's that?
Vote. We talked about a lot of men today who died, so you have the right to vote in a democracy. So get out there and do it.
What he said. Okay, so we're going to give you a break for a while. I don't know, maybe, do you want to come back in a few months maybe and talk about Patton, or?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, give me a break. I'll watch Ken.
And we have other authors lined up after Ken.
Okay, good.
Maybe a movie or two, and we'll see. As long as this continues to be a success, and hopefully people will actually start coming to this channel and then playing World of Tanks, because ultimately that is the purpose of this. Is a little bit of marketing for both of us.
Roger.
Being brutally honest.
Tech support, Bravo Zulu. Bravo Zulu.
Which hopefully the dinosaur knows what that means or where it comes from. Okay, so various people are saying thank you on the chat. Thank you very much. You survived as well. Guys, take care. We will see you in about a month. Harry, go to bed.
Roger
it's
that.
late for you. East Coast.
Author out.